IB Nation, Notre Dame fans, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. That's Trevor Trowbridge. I'm Brian Driscoll, and we are back today to talk Notre Dame football. And, Trev, we have so many topics we want to get into, and we're trying to kind of do some things where we're still kind of wrapping up the spring a little bit, but then also looking forward to the season. And we're like, what better way to do that than to talk about the Notre Dame portal class? And that's what we're going to discuss today. So what we're going to do with you guys today is we're going to kick the show off by talking about the incoming Notre Dame portal class, which as of right now is 8 people. We're going to start at the very beginning and talk about, the players we've seen, what are our impressions of them now that we've seen them live. We're going to talk about the incoming players that are still to arrive, one of which is already here, but he didn't practice because of an injury. So we'll kind of count him as a sort of a new addition to the room. And then we're going to talk about that'll be part one, just kind of looking at the class, evaluating the class. What do we expect the impact of this class to be? Because we have some strong opinions on that. But then in the second part of the show, we're going to look at this portal class and discuss, could this be the best portal class that Notre Dame has had yet? And we'll talk a little about just the impact that transfers have had on Notre Dame in recent seasons. And it's going to be an interesting conversation, Trevor, because the reality is in today's era, you can't ignore the transfer portal. It's going to impact you one way or the other, meaning you're going to either lose guys or get guys, and you're going to do both, really. But as far as what's your how's your roster impacted? Is what you're bringing in better than what you had going out? And you've seen teams try to ignore the portal entirely for the most part, and they haven't been able to do it. You've seen teams with an over-reliance on the portal, or basically their entire rosters being rebuilt on an annual basis like they're a basketball team. And then you have other teams that are trying to find that happy place, that sweet spot right in between, where they put a value on retention, but also understanding that we've got to be able to look at the portal to either add impact talent where it's needed or to add depth where it's needed. And so what we have seen from Notre Dame and Marcus Freeman, for example, and this coaching staff, is an embracing of the transfer portal in a way that I think works well for Notre Dame. Notre Dame was never going to be a school that was going to be able to thrive on just reloading every year in the portal with 15, 16, 20 guys like some schools are doing. And it was going to be difficult for Notre Dame to get a lot of guys that have multiple seasons of eligibility. They have gotten some, in the past, and we then obviously have gotten some this year, and even some, and it's not just in the past. Like they'd get guys that maybe were graduates, like Devin Ford is a graduate, but he had multiple years of eligibility remaining. But they, Isaiah Pryor was similar situation. But in this instance, they have actually started to get some undergrads that are actually some multiple year guys that are undergrads. And so we're seeing that sort of impact, and there's still some work to be done. But what I think, Trevor, is Notre Dame has gradually over the years, and we'll talk more about this in part 2, started to take the portal more and more seriously in different ways. And what it's allowed them to do is have a big impact. And so we'll talk in the second part of the show about the impact that that's had. But we're in a situation now looking at this 2025 class where if Notre Dame is going to reach their full potential as a program, a lot of what they need to develop is what's already there, what's already on the roster. But to really kind of take it really completely over the top, I do think the portal has to have an impact on this team. And so we're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about, whether this class is going to have the biggest impact yet. What are some things that could keep it from having that kind of impact? Some of them positive, some of them negative, and then really dive into it. But I really think this portal conversation is fascinating on a day like today, where, it sounds like, and I put an intel piece on the board for more information, but it sounds like we're not going to see the exodus from the program that we anticipated, partly because of Notre Dame being able to retain players, but also partly because of the delay in the House settlement, which was going to cap rosters at 105. So now Notre Dame, who's around 116, doesn't have to cut 11 players from their roster. I think that's great for the team, and being able to kind of keep that mindset of, hey, we're trying to work towards something. And then now it's like, okay, now it's time to add to the roster this summer. So, Trev, it's going to be an interesting conversation because we can say without a doubt that Notre Dame is not in the national championship game last year if they weren't willing to embrace the transfer portal. I'm confident in saying that there have been years in the past, 2020, where I don't think Notre Dame is a playoff team if they don't go to the transfer portal and pick up players like Nick McLeod and Ben Skoranek. So we have really seen the portal have a big impact on Notre Dame. Now the question is, what kind of impact is it going to have on 25? But the fact is this staff has certainly embraced the need to have a positive impact on your roster from the transfer portal.
It's a day and age of college football, man, and that's what is the reality now. And to your point, you brought up teams. I think of the Clemsons of the world that for the longest time they just refused to use the transfer portals, and it's a very old school mindset. Then you have the other teams. We've seen it, feast or famine with Florida State. One year they really relied on the transfer portal. They go 13-1. The next year they really rely on the transfer portal. They go 2-10. And so finding that happy middle ground is what helps you build a sustainable program, not just live on a year-to-year basis. And that's what the really good upper echelon teams of college football have been able to do. The Notre Dames, the Ohio States. I think last year with the expanded playoff was a prime example of why you still need impactful homegrown kids that you recruited out of your high school recruiting pipelines. I'll get more of that into that in the second part of today's show. But I do believe that the impact of the transfer portal class, it has a direct correlation to the success that they've had in high school recruiting as well. Marcus Freeman believes, along with myself and you and other people on the board, that the transfer portal should be used to supplement your roster, not build your roster. So I think the success that they've had in high school recruiting is a direct correlation to the success that they've had in the transfer portal, because they're able to be a little bit more narrow and more intentive with their search than just, all right, let's just go out and get big name guys. So I'm excited to talk about all of that today, man.
Trevor, I think when you look at the championship game from this past season, and I really look at the college football playoff, the Final Four as a whole, Texas is the team that probably had the most portal additions to their team. But even in there, a lot of the players were homegrown. And I count Quinn Ewers as homegrown because he was there for 4 years. Or 3 years. I know he spent his freshman year at Ohio State. That was supposed to be his senior year of high school. He did that to get money. He was developed at Texas. So even though he was a transfer, it's a different type of transfer. It's like Alohi Gilman was a transfer, but I kind of looked at Alohi as like a player that Notre Dame developed. He played 1 year at Navy, and then the rest of his career he played at Notre Dame. But when you look at it, Penn State had some transfer portal pickups, certainly, that helped that football team. But they were primarily a homegrown football team. Ohio State had some very important portal pickups, Caleb Downs, Quinshon Judkins, just to name a few. But they were primarily a homegrown team. Notre Dame certainly had a portal impact and at some very key positions, but by and large, the majority of their players were homegrown players. I think that's the sweet spot. It is for teams to be able to still build around high school recruiting and then supplement. And that's the thing, is it's not reloading, not rebuilding, but supplementing your current roster with the transfer portal class. I think that's the way to go. Some teams need to go to the portal heavy early on to rebuild a roster. We've talked about LSU needed to do that. Lincoln Riley kind of chose to do that because he chased a bunch of guys off and then brought a bunch of Oklahoma guys and other people with him. But I think you should be working towards, and I think this is like, for example, I think Brian Kelly's doing this at LSU, had to go to the portal to field a team really in his first couple of years. And he's still going to the portal. They just picked up a D tackle in the portal the other day. But you're seeing them start to, more high school kids, less transfer kids. But they are still in that mode where they're relying more on the portal than a Notre Dame is. But you can at least see that they're working towards not having to rely as much on the portal. You're seeing Georgia do it that way. Ohio State doing it that way. Ohio State's portal class this year, I believe, is much smaller, I believe, than last year's portal class, especially from some of the big name guys. Like, I know they need to go to the portal to get a running back. Not CJ Donaldson is not Quinshon Judkins. It's a little bit different, but you're seeing that. And Texas is still going to it a lot, but that's because Texas has kind of got themselves in this spot where, because they've been so reliant at the portal on certain positions, that it's forcing them to have to now go back in it. Notre Dame, fortunately, is gotten themselves out of that at quarterback, but there's still a couple positions where they're stuck in that as well. When you look at the nickel position, they've yet to develop they're going to develop a homegrown quarterback before they're going to develop a homegrown nickel. And so we'll talk about that as well. But I think those are all interesting aspects to this. So, let's talk about this transfer portal class for Notre Dame, Trevor. And if you look at the numbers for Notre Dame, they're about 50-50 for what they added and what they lost. If you look at it, they had 9 departures in the spring or in the winter portal, but two of those departures were not guys that were really with the team anymore. So it was really only 7. And then another guy in Jaden Mickey, who had left the team like beginning of the season. So it's kind of like 3 of the guys that jumped in weren't exactly guys that were being taken away from the team that played for the title. I really only counted as 6. And then, of course, you have 4 guys jump in the portal this spring. So that's 10 guys. None of those guys were starters. On Zach Yoakum was not the starting kicker. He filled in for some people. You had Kennedy Urlacher and Steve Angeli were not starters. And then Notre Dame has added, 8 players in the portal so far this offseason. So, in the winter, they have not added anybody in the spring. And I don't anticipate them adding anyone in the spring. There are some players that they had on their radar when certain players are talking about maybe leaving, but I think Notre Dame has backed off that. There are still a couple positions that I could see them kind of having their eye on if the right veteran wanted to come in and be okay, sort of being the veteran in the room at some positions, knowing he's not going to be the starter. There might be a couple positions where maybe they're a little worried about health and may look at a guy for depth or special teams, but they're not looking for impact players. They're not in the bidding war for a lot of the guys on the that are out there now. And I don't think it's a ton of impact players in the portal at all. And that's factored into this conversation as well. Like, I was expecting more quarterbacks to jump in. They didn't. I was expecting some more big name guys to jump in. They didn't. And I think part of that's because a lot of teams are doing what they need to do to keep their talent in-house with paying them the money that they need to pay them. So when I look at this portal class, Trev, obviously things start off with the guys that we've already seen. And I think it's important to kind of talk about them, because now you always say, hey, I think this guy's really good, but I need to see him do it in a Notre Dame uniform. Well, for a few of these guys, we have now seen them in a Notre Dame uniform, Trev. So we have been able to see, for example, Will Pauling to a degree in a Notre Dame uniform. We saw Jared Dawson in a Notre Dame uniform. We saw Elijah Hughes in a Notre Dame uniform. We've seen Devonte Smith in a Notre Dame uniform, and we've seen Noah Burnett in a Notre Dame uniform. So let's talk about kind of our impressions of them. 1 offensive player, 3 special teams, or 3 defensive players and 1 special teams player. And I want to start off with Will Pauling, Trev, because I know you have a very interesting take on Will Pauling, which I want to start off with him, because obviously we know what Will Pauling came here to do. He's obviously a player that came from Wisconsin via Cincinnati. We know the background there. Obviously played for Mike Brown for all but 1 year of his career in college. This past season only caught 42 passes for only 407 yards, averaged 9.7 yards per catch and 3 touchdowns in a year where he missed 2 games. Actually missed 2 games because Wisconsin didn't go to a bowl game. Year before at Wisconsin, he was banged up a lot. Year before at Wisconsin, better quarterback situation. He caught 74 passes for 837 yards, 11.3 per catch, 6 touchdowns, had 8 catches for 143 yards and 2 touchdowns in a bowl loss to LSU. Also had 4 catches for 51 yards and a touchdown in the loss to Ohio State. Had 7 catches for 95 yards and a touchdown against Illinois. And so a guy that's had some success, had 9 catches this past season against Alabama, had 8 catches for 79 yards against Penn State this past season as well. So, he's a guy that what version of Will Pauling are you going to get? I think that's somewhat of a question, and we didn't really know that. And I'd say to a degree, Trev, that's still kind of true, because we still don't definitively know what version we're going to get. But late in the spring, we started to get a little bit of a glimpse of that. And I know that is something that I know had an impact on you.
Yeah, seeing somebody do it in a Notre Dame uniform is a big deal for me. And like we're going to get into in part two, the players that Notre Dame has brought in via the transfer portal always have good upside because Notre Dame isn't just bringing in players to bring in players. But I'd be lying if I said that they were batting 1,000 for all the players that they brought in the transfer portal in terms of like major impact. The biggest complaint that I had about the wide receiver room the last really 2 seasons, go back, I mean, honestly, really the last 3 seasons, was the inconsistency to which they played. And I look at a guy like Will Pauling, who, even though he was injured last season, in 6 of the 9 games that he recorded stats, he went over 45 yards receiving. And that carries a lot of weight for me because Notre Dame needs that consistent level of play week in and week out. And when I use 45 yards because it's unrealistic to say, he went over 90 yards against Bama or something, and it's like, I would love for that to be the case week in and week out. I just think that's not realistic based on what Notre Dame's offense is. You look at a guy like Jaden Greathouse, he went over 45 yards last season in games like 4 times, 2 of it being in the postseason. Now, they were the biggest games that they played in. Different conversation for a different day. But I look at a guy like Will Pauling, and he brings that level of consistency to the table for this room. He's a veteran. I think he showed that presence in the spring. And then from the blue gold game, even though he didn't record a catch, got to see a little bit of his game. I think he's a pretty good route runner. He's faster than what I thought. His vertical downfield speed is a lot better than what I thought it was. Ben Minnick, also learned about him this offseason. He's very fast. Kid can move. And Will Pauling had a step on him on that throw from Kenny, and Kenny ended up overthrowing 2 very fast players. Again, another conversation for a different day. But Will Pauling left a good impression on me, and I was impressed with him for his ability even being at 75% for most of spring when we saw him. There are still some drop issues in some of the practices that we've seen, routes versus air, something like that. I know he had 10 drops last season at Wisconsin, also only in 9 games where he had stats recorded. That is something I'm going to be monitoring. So that is going to be interesting to see. He played in 10. He recorded stats in 9. Mm-hmm. So that's going to be something I'm going to be monitoring as the season goes on. I like the top of where Notre Dame's receiving room is at with what they have coming into the summer and Jaden Greathouse and Jordan Faison. But below that, it's a lot of, well, if this, if that, if he, maybe he, and Will Pauling kind of fits into that middle group. And I think that he can help bring along some of those young guys and be a good transition wide receiver for all of the what ifs that are the young guys.
It's interesting how quarterback play can impact some of those things. So if you look at Will Pauling, for example, this past season, Trev, at Wisconsin, he was targeted 75 times compared to 109 times the year before. But this past season, he had more drops, 10 versus 7, and he had fewer contested catches than he had the year before, including a lower contested catch percentage. He had way significantly fewer first downs. He had 42 first down catches the year before. He only had 19 last year. And it is interesting how, even though he was targeted much more in 2023, for whatever reason, he felt comfortable, more comfortable with the quarterback situation 2 years ago than he did last year, partly because 2 years ago they had a starter that spent most of the season as a starter, Tanner Mordecai. He had he got banged up a little bit and missed some time. And then this past season, obviously, the quarterback situation was a bit of a mess at Wisconsin. Again, it's been a big issue under Luke Fickell. But I look at him and say, I'm with you. I still think it's a bit of an unknown from what we see. But here's where I'm encouraged by what we saw from Will Pauling. Lot we need to prove. He's got to show that he can play outside some. But because you just can't keep him inside all the time. He's got to be able to help you a little bit outside. Otherwise, okay, are you just comfortable being a backup to Jaden Greathouse? I don't know that moving Jaden Greathouse to Z as a starter to make sure that you get more playing time for Will Pauling necessarily is the best thing for the receiver room, because I still think Jaden Greathouse is your best slot. But what I was encouraged by this spring, Trev, is I saw more juice from him in the last couple sessions, especially in the blue gold game. Watching him in pregame go through drills, watching him come off the line with some explosiveness on a couple routes. Didn't catch the ball. Not one pass. I didn't think he dropped any, but he was targeted twice. Neither were completions. But to see that speed, so like he ran by Ben Minnick and just ran by him on that slot fade. Some people may say, hey, listen, that's Ben Minnick. Who cares? All right, Ben Minnick hasn't played a lot of football at Notre Dame, but the one thing you talk to anybody in that program about Ben Minnick, the one thing they'll say to you, that cat can fly. Ben can run. He just hasn't been able to stay healthy. So now we got to see if that can carry over into the season and into production. But to see that juice from him, to me, was important. So if we're grading Will Pauling's spring performance, it's an incomplete. He was injured most of the time. And we still don't know where he's going to play as far as, like, we know he's going to play a lot in the slot, but what's the split? Is it just slot? Is it Jaden Greathouse that has to move around? Like, that's an interesting dynamic that I'm curious to see. But I'm more confident saying this now than I was when they got him. Will Pauling adds juice and playmaking ability to your receiving core. That I have no more doubt about, just to see that kind of speed, because you're like, okay, now what he saw against LSU, that wasn't just because LSU has a bad secondary. I've seen it with my own eyes that he can run by people. And that was an encouraging thing for me. So, now we have to see if he can build on that in the fall. Defensively, I kind of felt the same way about Jared Dawson, Trev. I didn't see a whole lot from him throughout the spring practices. Saw a little bit of flash in the Jersey scrimmage, not a ton. Didn't see him do much during the individual practices because, again, the D-line wasn't doing a lot of full speed stuff. So when we say didn't see a lot, it's not like we saw it and we didn't see nothing. Like, that's not good. It's we literally didn't get a chance to see them do much during the spring. Blue Gold game comes around, and Jared Dawson looked like the Jared Dawson at Louisville. And that was a good sign. I think Jared Dawson is one of the biggest enigmas in his class because there's film on him at Louisville where you're like, that's a dude. And then there's film on him at Louisville where it's like, does he want to be there right now? Like, how good does this guy want to be? And I think that's still my biggest question with Jared Dawson is, how good do you want to be? How good do you want your last year? What final impression do you want to leave on NFL scouts? Because if Jared Dawson goes into this season and we get a consistent version of Jared Dawson, the guy that we saw against Notre Dame last year when he was whooping Notre Dame's O-line, the Jared Dawson we saw in the Blue Gold game at times, if we get that version of Jared Dawson for 12 games in the regular season, he's going to have a huge impact. And people can say, well, you're not going to replace Howard Cross and Riley Mills. I don't think you're going to replace Riley Mills, but if Jared Dawson is the player I think he's capable of being and what he's flashed, I think he can absolutely replace Howard Cross and be more productive than Howard Cross. But it's got to be consistent if it's really going to be that kind of an upgrade. So I like what I've seen from him. So I like what I saw from him in the Blue Gold game. And then obviously some of the impressive film at Louisville. The big question I have, though, is just that consistency. But even if he's just flashy, that's what Howard Cross was last year. He was an inconsistent player that flashed at times. So it's not a downgrade. It's just in order to be an upgrade, you're just going to have to be a little more consistent. I also think, having seen him in person, he's not going to be a guy that's going to play the volume that Howard Cross played, and that's okay. I can live with that. I just need the high level of impact plays per snap that he had at Louisville. That's going to be the big key for me.
Yeah, I echoed a lot of the same as you when it comes to Jared Dawson. I was very pleased with his performance in the Blue Gold game. I was a little bit nervous that a player who was that effective at Louisville didn't play more snaps. And I'm not saying the high volume that Howard Cross did, but I think Jared Dawson was somewhere around 294. Howard Cross was probably even with the injury, well over 600. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but finding somewhere the in-between I thought was interesting. And I think that goes to a little bit of what you said about there's times where you look at Jared Dawson, it's like, look, man, do you want to be here today? And there's times where you look at Jared Dawson, it's like, ooh, okay, Louisville's D-line has a guy. And so if he can just raise his level of consistency, I think that's huge. he wasn't, to your point, brought in to replace any one individual person, but what he adds to the room is depth. He's a very effective player. I don't know. I know we're not at the stage yet of predicting starting lineups or what that looks like. There's still players that have to get to campus, and you got to go through summer and fall camp. But if he can play at a more consistent level and be an effective part of the rotation, it can't be when they put him in there. Sometimes, depending on the opponent, he's not really feeling it, or depending on the opponent, he brings it. If he can be consistent, he's going to be a really valuable asset to Al Washington and the rest of that defensive line. So that's something that brings me a lot of promise. But that was my question about him when he came in. If you're that effective, how do you not play more than 290 snaps?
Well, in one thing that I'll say is, number one, I don't know that he has the body type, or not the body type. There are some guys that they just can't go like as long. I'm trying to think. There was a D lineman like that recently who just once that guy got past 20, he just, and some guys are just those type of players. The other thing is they were very deep at D tackle the last couple of years. That's the other thing is they didn't have to play a lot of guys differently. But I also think that's part of it though, Trev, is to your point is, did they always feel like they were going to be able to consistently get the most out of him? And did that impact how often he played? I think that's part of it. And he did miss a couple games over the last couple of years as well. So I think when I look at Jared Dawson, that's a big part of what I see when I evaluate him is, like last year he played 294 snaps. That was in 10 games. So if he would have played all 13 games, he would have had more snaps than anybody else at the position. But they had 3 guys over 300 snaps, another guy at 298, and then Jared Dawson's at 294. So they played a lot of guys. They got Thor Griffith in the portal last year from Harvard. So that's the other thing is they just chose to go with the committee approach, which last year, I don't know that that's good for Notre Dame. I honestly, if he could only go 25 snaps a game, and that last year would have been a problem. Couple reasons why. They didn't have the depth, and Rubio's hurt at the beginning of the year. And then once Rubio got back, then Onye's gone, and then Cross just wasn't the same guy. They would have maybe needed that if he was there instead of Howard Cross.
Yeah.
Now with Rubio and Onye and Donovan Heinisch all coming back, plus you've got the emergence of Armel Mukum, you've got Brendan Vernon should be back this fall. You've got Sean Sevillano ready to play now more. They're going to count on him a little bit more. And then, of course, you've got Dawson and Elijah Hughes, the 2 transfers. I think you're going to see more of a wave approach this year than you did last year. So I think they won't need that as much, that he wasn't that guy. Because I think at this point in time, Trev, when you get to your 5th season, in some areas like that, you kind of are who you are. You just, that's just kind of your deal. And what's funny is the year before, when he played 55 less snaps, he was more effective as a pass rusher. But this year, in more snaps, he wasn't quite as effective as a pass rusher, but he's a lot better as a run defender. So how does Notre Dame find that sweet spot? And then what role is he going to have? Is he going to be a guy that, maybe plays more against teams that throw the football? Is he a guy that plays more, or is it just going to be kind of the same? We're going to find out. Elijah Hughes is another guy we saw, Trev. He's a USC pickup. He was the guy that I think we had the most questions about coming into Notre Dame because there just was very little film of him. My early impressions of Elijah Hughes, good-sized kid, and legit 6'3", legit 290, quality athlete. I'd heard a lot of things about how twitchy he was and how athletic he was, and I haven't really seen that. But I see a kid that's got some good overall solid athleticism, pretty good motor, and a pretty tough kid that at the very least gives you a solid rotation player. I didn't see potential impact player from Elijah Hughes, but that's okay. I think they have enough potential impact players at D tackle. I see a guy that's maybe a little bit different than Jared Dawson, where he may not have the flashy plays that Dawson has.
Yeah. But
he's going to give you more consistent, I'm going to go to work and battle with you. That's what I saw from Elijah Hughes this spring so far, Trev.
Well, the thing that excites me about Elijah Hughes is this isn't his last year in South Bend. In theory, that transfer portal day and age now, but ideally he stays for multiple seasons. And that's my biggest thing with Elijah Hughes is the patience aspect. Tools are there. He's a quality athlete, to your point. I like his size. It is funny that he's wearing the same number that Howard Cross was last year, and it's like he's like a little bit more filled out. He's a little bigger.
He's like if Howard Cross was as big as you'd hope he is, like 6'3", 290. Yeah.
Yeah. And so for him, it's biggest name of the game for me for Elijah Hughes is just being patient with him. I don't think the staff brought him in to be an impact player for 2025. Rotational piece, potentially, depending on what the rest of the room looked like. But I don't think they looked at Elijah Hughes and like, dude, I think we just got our starting 3 technique. I think it was like
there was one coach who thought that, but he doesn't coach on defense.
Fair enough.
I'll just leave it at that.
Fair enough.
And it's not the head coach either. I'll just leave it at that.
So when I look at a guy like him, I can already see some of the questions coming in towards the end of the season. What happened to Elijah Hughes? What's going on? Did they waste a portal pickup? No. I like what he brings to the table. I think he's going to be a rotational guy. I don't think he's going to be a strong impact guy, but I like the tools that I saw from him. He does have a quick first step. I don't know if it's as fast as advertised. I'm not saying that it's not. I just haven't seen it, because for a lot of the reasons like what Bryan talked about, there were moments in practice where we physically could not see the defensive line. Mm-hmm. And so,
or if we could, they were doing things like I could see them a little bit more than you could because I was down in the field doing video.
Yeah.
But they were just going through sleds. They were outside on the sleds. You're not going to learn a lot about a guy's, you can see some things about, he comes off, he's got some pop, but we're not seeing like that long, you can see the initial burst, but we're not seeing that long range athleticism, the playmaking ability, block destruction, all that kind of stuff. We can't see that stuff.
The thing that does make me excited, though, about him is at USC, he played both on the interior and on the edge of the line. And we saw a little snippet in the blue gold game of them playing a little bit of an odd front. I don't know if that's here to stay. That could have been because they were just really, really light at defensive end. Logan Thomas was out. Obviously, Boubacar and Jordan Botelho were out. And then we didn't see Junior Tuihalamaka or Josh Burnham. So could have just been something that they were trying. But they have an asset in Elijah Hughes that has that ability. We've seen him do it in games. That's where he got a sack against Nebraska, I believe. I think he was lined up on the edge. And so that's just another dynamic that he brings to the room. The defensive line, more specifically the interior, they're starting to diversify the talent that they have in that room. And I think Elijah Hughes adds to that mix.
Final piece of the spring puzzles, Noah Burnett, kicker from North Carolina. And I can say it now because we weren't really allowed to address certain things from the spring. But now that you've seen it in the blue gold game, we can kind of follow up with what you saw in the blue gold game is what we've seen in practice. When he nails it, it's pretty good. When he doesn't nail it, it's not close. I mean, we saw a couple of those like whoa, what was that? And Vince is about to lose it because he's like, Vince looks at that stuff a little bit differently than we do. But I'm concerned about field goal kicking right now for Notre Dame. I am. Noah Burnett's had one solid year, one really good year, another kind of okay solid year. What is Notre Dame going to get? I don't know. And then the fact that I think he said or somebody said like they're tinkering with his – I don't understand why. Because whatever you're tinkering with, it hasn't worked because he looks worse than he did when he was in North Carolina. So you better figure it out real quick because I don't have a ton of confidence right now in Notre Dame. I feel a lot like we did with Spencer Schrader, but without the strong leg.
Yeah.
Like with Spencer Schrader, like it almost is like if he was over 50, you're like, he's good. We got this. Don't worry about it. It's like, if you're trying to go for a game winner, it's third down and you're in 42-yard field goal range. You're almost like, dude, take a sack. You know what I mean? Like take a big sack, like maybe 10-yard sack and let him kick from 52 because he's got a better shot at nailing that than one from 40. It just without that big, strong leg, you just don't know what you're going to get. I'll be honest, Trev, I'm a little bit nervous about field goal kicking right now. Now, we haven't seen Eric Schmidt, the freshman stud, but the hope was that he wasn't going to have to do that as a freshman.
Yeah.
So whatever they're working with Noah Burnett, I have one bit of advice for him and Marty Biaggi. Figure it out because what we saw this spring was very concerning. It'd be one thing. It was like one practice. We saw it at a practice. We saw it at the Jersey scrimmage. We saw it in the blue gold game. It ain't good.
Yeah. I mean, current state, I think that opens the door for Eric Schmidt if he comes in and he's more consistent, Who knows what that looks like? I'm with you.
Yeah.
I would have liked him to handle more kickoff duties during his freshman year. That's kind of why you brought in a transfer portal kid to be your place kicker for the third year in a row. But as of right now, at this point, I think it's kind of up for debate. Now, there are practices that we hadn't seen, but to your point, Brian, we saw it in multiple practices. And so we'll see, but it's got to get figured out.
Yeah.
Got to get figured out.
Yeah, no doubt. So, Trev, that's part one of today's portal show. Any final thoughts about it? Just kind of overall, I will say this. Actually, no, there's one guy we forgot to talk about. One really good player we forgot to talk about. And I don't know why I keep forgetting about him. Devonte Smith. Of all the portal additions, this is the one I am most encouraged by from what we saw this spring. Like, look, I like the Devonte Smith pickup. We talked about it. I like the film at Alabama. I didn't think they always used him great, but like the Georgia game, he gets beat first play of the game on, I think it was a slant for 15 yards, and then after that locks the Georgia slots down. He was a pretty good player at Bama when they used him effectively. Comes to Notre Dame. We understand the reasons why. Actually kind of respect the reasons why. Wants to get closer to home. Wants to be closer to his child. All these type of things. Wants to get a degree, master's degree from Notre Dame. And you're like, okay, he's got one final shot to make an impact in college, but also to show the NFL something. I'm like, how's he going to be? I mean, you think, oh, he's from Bama. Everybody gets all excited about a guy from Bama, blah, blah, Bama. Okay, whatever. And I almost kind of have like a natural like pushback because I just don't want to jump into the Bama hype. But then I see him in really the first practice. From the first practice on, because we do see like they do a lot of different things with the DBs in pre-practice. Like a lot of movement, a lot of flipping your hips, a lot of working on positioning and hand placement and like staying on top of a guy when you stay on top, being underneath the guy when you need to be underneath, working on the footwork and the transitions. Like Mike Mickens does about as much footwork work as anybody on the staff. Him and Mike Brown both really amongst the skill players. And it was really I was really impressed with what I saw from Devonte Smith athletically. He was a better athlete in person than what I thought he was going to be. He was a good athlete on film, don't get me wrong, but he's a little bit twitchier than I thought. But the bigger thing is he's a lot stronger than I thought he was going to be. Like there's a couple times, like you guys saw it in the blue gold game where he kind of muscles Jaden Greathouse out of bounds. Jaden Greathouse is strong. So to muscle him out of bounds, you've got to have some strength. And that wasn't the only time we saw that from him against guys in the spring. They kind of limited his overall work, which is fine. But, Trev, I got to tell you, man, what I saw from Devonte Smith in the spring, I said off film, I thought he could maybe be the best nickel they've landed so far. I don't have a doubt about it now. I think Thomas Harper was the best one so far. With all due respect to Jordan Clark, who had a really nice year for Notre Dame last year. But Thomas Harper, I thought overall was just a more impactful player. I think Devonte Smith has a chance to be the best nickel they've had so far, especially from the portal guys. So he's the one guy that I'm even most encouraged by, having seen him in person, seen him at practice, seen him in the blue gold game, he actually didn't play in the Jersey scrimmage. But man, I was really impressed with what we saw from Devonte Smith this spring. Like, even more excited about the pickup now than I was when they first got him.
Yeah, when you go and look at the transfers that were active participants in the spring, he was the only starter on offense and defense that played all 12 games last year. And I think that showed with Devonte Smith. I think it showed that he was very comfortable with what he was doing. Will Pauling was injured last season. He didn't play the full 12 games, and then he came in and had some stuff cleaned up and was 75%. Jared Dawson, he was a rotational guy. Elijah Hughes, same thing. So for me, Devonte Smith just looked like the starter. And I mentioned this in a couple of different shows, but the coaching staff treated him like how they treated their own returning starters. They held him out of things, not due to health, but just, hey, look, workload management, we're treating you like a proven player. And that gave me a lot of confidence as well. Some position coaches may be up for debate if they had a transfer and they were holding him out like a proven player. At this point, I'm kind of in the, look, Coach Mickens, that's your judgment call. I'm kind of on board with you. And so, for me, I'm really excited to see what Devonte Smith continues to do. Another promising thing for me is Ben Minnick took a lot of reps at nickel in the spring practices, and Devonte Smith was also very attentive with him, helping him learn some different things, help learn the technique. And I'm sure that was also that same sentiment was passed on to Carson Hobbs, because the development that Carson Hobbs had at nickel in just a week, from what we saw in the Jersey scrimmage to what we saw in the blue gold game, there was an improvement there as well. And so I'm happy he's in the room. For me, if we're kind of ranking these, I walk away with him being probably the most impactful spring transfer that we got to see so far. And I'm really excited about that.
I agree. I'd say him 1, probably Jared Dawson 2, Will Pauling 3. And I think Will Pauling could go up. Elijah Hughes 4, Noah Burnett 5. That's everybody, right? One special teams, 1 offense, 3 defense.
Yes.
Okay. So, yeah, overall, pleased with what we've seen from them, with the exception of the kicking situation.
Yeah.
But it's early yet. New holder, there's a lot of new snapper, there's a lot of things that Noah Burnett's getting used to for him. It's not just you show up and kick. You had a holder you were comfortable with for what, at North Carolina. I mean, that's one of those things that can really mess with a kicker. So we'll see how that continues to improve as we get into the spring. But overall, Trev, I'm pleased with what we've seen from the portal class. I think there's some potential there. There's some impact potential there. Now we got to see him carried over in the fall. The good news is, Mr. Trowbridge, is that's not it. That's not everybody that's coming. There's going to be 3 guys showing up this summer. Well, 2 showing up this summer. 1 guy's going to finally be able to practice this summer. And Notre Dame is set to welcome wide receiver Malachi Fields, tight end Ty Washington, who we've actually seen in person. He was at a practice. We just haven't seen him do any workouts. He was in sweats and slides at the practice, so we didn't get to see him get to do much. And then, of course, Jalen Stroman, who was with the team all spring, so he learned the defense, but he was injured coming back from a broken clavicle, so he didn't get a practice at all. We're going to get to see them this summer. So let's talk about these newcomers to the team that we're going to see this spring and sort of their impact. And honestly, Trev, if you're going to have this conversation, it has to start with Malachi Fields, who was the sort of the crown jewel of this class from a portal standpoint. And you're seeing a lot of hype about him. A lot of it's deserved. Some of it, I'm like, let's pump the brakes a little bit. I saw a preseason or a way too early mock draft for 2026, have him go number 8. I'm like, all right, let's slow down a little bit with the hype machine for Malachi Fields. Let's see what he can do at Notre Dame. If he just repeats what he did at Virginia, I'm happy. I'm happy. That doesn't make him a first-round draft pick. It definitely doesn't make him a top 10 draft pick. But that's all I need is for him to be what he was at Virginia. I don't need him to come in here and catch 75 passes for 1,200 yards in a regular season. I don't need that. If he does it, great. But I don't need that. They have a lot of other weapons that they can have as part of a balanced passing attack. But I do think it's important that Notre Dame has a legitimate weapon in the boundary. They're going to have a first-time starter at quarterback, a first-time starter who's never played a meaningful snap of college football. Having a 6'4", 220 dependable boundary player is going to be important. And that's what they need Malachi Fields to be. If he goes beyond that and becomes a game changer, sweet. That's great. But that's where I'm in he's going to have to show me that. But what I am very comfortable saying, and where we kind of disagree, is I don't need to see him do anything in a Notre Dame uniform to say comfortably, I expect him and have no doubt he will be what he was at Virginia, because it's Power 5 to Power 5. I mean, if you look at Bo Collins was at Notre Dame exactly what he was at Clemson. It's what he was. Jaden Marshall was at Notre Dame exactly what he was at Marshall. And he was going up a jump. Chris Mitchell obviously didn't. But a lot of the guys we've seen come from other Power 5 schools have kind of been Skoranek was exactly at Notre Dame what he was at Northwestern. That's a good football player. We haven't seen a lot of guys come to Notre Dame and make like a giant jump from the portal. the veterans. Alohi Gilman clearly did, but he only played as a freshman at Navy before coming to Notre Dame. I'm talking about the guys that came here as veterans. They kind of just were them. They were who they were with a better team around them. Jack Cohn, Riley Leonard. I mean, a lot of those different types of players. So all I'm expecting from Malachi Fields is be what you were at Virginia. 50 to 55 catches, 800 to 830 yards receiving in the regular season. 5-6 touchdowns. That's all he needs to do for me to say this is a great pickup. Because what that gives you, Trevor, is, as I said, a big, physical, quality athlete that's dependable in the boundary for your first-time starting quarterback. That is huge, huge. The difference for Malachi Fields at Notre Dame compared to what he was last year at Virginia is you give him that, and he's going to – I mean, if he does that, you're going to have a lot more production around him. Where last year at Virginia is if Malachi Fields wasn't making plays, that pass offense was doing nothing outside of him. I mean, their next highest pass catcher last year had 394 yards. Their next highest pass catcher had 221. They had 3 total receivers with over 200 yards receiving. 221, 394, and then Malachi at 808. Year before, they had Malik Washington who went over 1,400. But a little bit of a different deal last year when he was kind of the guy because he was the complement to Malachi Fields in 2022. He didn't have, or 2023, he didn't have that for himself in 2024. All I need to see from him, Trev, is repeat what you were the last 2 years of Virginia. If he does that, that's a big win for Notre Dame. Anything beyond that's kind of gravy for me. And so we're going to find out if he can do that. I expect that he will. I have no doubt that he will because, again, he's doing it. He'll be playing against teams he's played before. That's really the biggest reason why. And he'll have a better supporting cast around him. There's no reason for me to think that he won't be as good, assuming he's able to be healthy. That's always the thing that you can't prepare for.
Sure. Yeah, when I look at a guy like Malachi Fields, you look at his tools and his athletic ability, what he brings to the table. I think he walks into this wide receiver room and instantly becomes your best wide receiver. He's the most experienced. He's put up the most production. He's the biggest. I don't know. He's probably not the fastest. But
no, but like he can stretch the field more effectively than anybody else because of that combination of size and the speed that he does have.
Mm-hmm. And he's the only player in that room that has that skill set of being 6'4" and being able to play in the boundary. So when I look at Notre Dame's wide receiver room, they get an immediate bump the second that he puts on the blue and gold when he gets here in the summer. And I'm really excited for it. It is a weird thing that I have with needing to see it because I am confident that he's going to be able to repeat it. But I think for me, it's just a level of comfortability, I guess. And maybe that's how I look at it. But for a kid like Malachi Fields, he comes in, like I said, and I'm fully confident that he becomes the best wide receiver in that room. And that's not a shot at the other receivers that they have in that room because I'm high on that talent as well. But I love everything that he brings to the table, man. It's really exciting.
Honestly, of all the transfer guys, everyone else, I think they could be fine if they don't play. I think Devonte Smith is probably a guy where I'm not sure you're going to be as good at nickel if you don't have him this year. That'd be my other one. Maybe Jared Dawson because he's more of a pass rusher and not a lot of the other guys at the position are proven pass rushers. Those two guys, obviously, if you don't have them, if they go down, don't play as well, it's going to impact you, but not as much as if Malachi Fields goes down or isn't the player that we hope that he could be. He is the biggest need pickup as well as arguably the best player. I think he's the best player they picked up, but is also the biggest need because you said it, Trev. They don't have anybody else like him at that position. I mean, Micah Gilbert at 6'2", 205 is your next biggest wide receiver. And he's got 0 career catches. Like, you need Malachi Fields to be what we all hope that he can be. You need him to be healthy and you need him to produce like he did at Virginia. I don't need him to play above and beyond that. If he does, like I said, if he's like at 65 catches, 65 catches in the regular season, 1,000 yards or around, I mean, then holy moly, that means Notre Dame's really good. But what he didn't have in Virginia last year was an Eli Raridan. He didn't have a Jaden Greathouse. He didn't have a Will Pauling. He didn't have a Jordan Faison. He didn't have a Jeremiah Love coming out of the backfield, with all due respect to Xavier Brown. and Kobe Pace. Like he doesn't have to be that guy for Notre Dame. Like every game where if I don't play well, we're screwed. But if he does play well, then this team is going to be really hard to beat. And so that's kind of where we are. Malachi Fields, they really need him, really need him to step up and be that guy.
Well, and with all due respect to the other transfers that they brought in, he's the one that can single-handedly impact one side of the ball. I'm really high on Devonte Smith, like we just got done talking about. I'm excited to see what Jared Dawson does in the season. But if they didn't have those two guys, my takeaway wouldn't be, well, let's hope the defense is still good, because I think that they would be. Or at least, you look at Devonte Smith, it's like, man, I hope the secondary can remain at an elite level, because I have a question at nickel. Whereas I look at the offense and it's like, without Malachi Fields, I don't know what the passing attack looks like. Because to your point, their next biggest receiver is Micah Gilbert, who is coming off of an injury from the spring and has 0 career catches. And he's played like 37 snaps in his entire collegiate career. So that's a question mark. But now that they have him, I think he has the opportunity to be as impactful as any transfer outside of quarterback that they've gotten.
Yes. I mean, you could make a case that his impact, if he's able to produce at the level he did the last 2 years, you could argue that his impact will be as it will have as big of an impact on this offense as what Riley Leonard had on last year's offense. In this regard, if you take Riley off last year's offense, they're not the team that they were. They're not making a deep run. I don't know that you can say quite the same about Malachi, because he's not a quarterback. But so from a negative standpoint, I think Notre Dame can still go play for a championship without Malachi Fields. It's just going to be playing well. It's just going to be tougher. With Riley, it just wasn't happening. I'm more looking at it from the positive aspect of, by inserting him, if he does play his game, he elevates you in a way that nobody else on that roster could. And that's where I'm coming, because it's impossible to take the negative effect when you're talking about a receiver versus a quarterback. But the positive effect, I think you can somewhat mirror, in that he takes you over the top of what otherwise was going to be a pretty decent unit. So as best as you can compare a quarterback to a skill player, I think Malachi can have that similar type of impact. Whereas if we get the best version of Will Pauling, that's awesome. Love it. It'll have an impact. But it doesn't elevate the rest of the offense the same way that Malachi having a strong season does. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but I just feel like some positions and some skill sets, it's numbers and it's impactful, but others just, if two guys do the exact same thing, if Will Pauling has 50 catches for 800 yards, and Malachi Fields has 50 catches for 800 yards, for me, when I look at that for me thing again, when I evaluate the impact of the two positions, that boundary position, it's more impactful for me than the other one would be, just because of the way that the offense runs. And that's why it's so important. I think you can kind of plug a lot of different guys into that Z, and they could give you 50 for 800 if they're targeted enough.
Sure.
Not a lot of guys can go and do that in the boundary. And that's the difference. And when you look at the impact he can make. The other guy that shows up this spring, Trev, and this is probably the biggest, certainly the biggest enigma on offense. We talked about Elijah Hughes on defense. This is the biggest one on offense, and that's Ty Washington. Because if you look at Ty Washington in the limited film we've seen, like if all I showed everyone, if we just popped in the Ole Miss game from 2023, and we just, as a group of people, we just broke down the Ole Miss film from 2023, and said, hey guys, this is what Notre Dame is getting in the transfer portal at tight end. And that's all we showed. I mean, people would be like, okay, like we got ourselves a football player. We're pretty excited about that. We think this guy's going to be a pretty good player. He's going to be this, he's going to be that. And then I'd say, okay, let's do it. 7 catches for 90 yards and 2 touchdowns. Problem is, In the rest of his career, he has a grand total of 4, 5, 7 catches the rest of his career in 3 years at Arkansas. So, you look at that, Trev, and you're like, a guy has, 187, plus 25. So that's what, 212? Is that correct? Is that math correct?
Yes.
7 catches for 90 of those yards came in one game. Like, okay, well, he's capable of doing it. He did it that one time. But the question is, are we going to see that at Notre Dame or not? Because I could see Ty Washington stepping in and being a legitimate, like, complementary player, pass game weapon at receiver. At tight end. And then we could see Ty Washington be 4th string. And I have no idea. And there's things in between. And I have no idea what we're going to get from Ty Washington. We're going to find out this spring, but I have no idea what to expect from him. But it's hard not to watch that one game against Ole Miss. And it wasn't fluky. It wasn't like he caught a couple crossing routes and was wide open and ran for a bunch of yards. Like, you break down that film, you're like, that dude can play. Like, that dude can ball. What is going on here? And then he did nothing the rest of his career. Is that an Arkansas problem? Is that a Ty Washington problem? We're going to find out. We're going to get our first glimpse of it this summer. But I honestly, Trev, have no idea what to expect from Ty Washington.
Yeah, when I look at the last 2 portal guys that we're going to talk about, because of the elevation of the 2 rooms that they're going to, I have no idea where they fit in, if I'm just being 100% honest. Like, if I look at the rooms both as a whole, it wouldn't surprise me if somebody told me, yo, Ty Washington's like, he's number 2. He's on the field all the time. He's making plays downfield. I'm like, okay, based on what I saw in the limited film, I see that. Or if you told me, yeah, he rotates in sometimes when Kevin Bauman needs a breather and him and Jack Larson kind of split number 3 reps, I'd be like, yeah, I get that too. I don't know where he fits in. He has the tools. I like where he's at. But to your point, I don't know where he fits in this mix. Now, luckily, same light as Elijah Hughes, Notre Dame doesn't just have Ty Washington for a year. But not to get the cart too far in front of the horse, at some point you'll get Cooper Flanagan back. James Flanagan will be a year older. Jack Larson will be a year older. So then where does he fit in that mix too? Maybe more of an H-back. I don't know what Mike Denbrock all has planned for the offense this year. I don't know how he's going to use certain personnel groups, but I'm interested to see where Ty Washington fits in this mix because he can be a valuable piece to this offense. I just don't know what that is yet, especially when the tight ends had the spring that they had. Because I look at the skill set that Jack Larson has, and it's kind of the same skill set as what Ty Washington has, and Jack Larson's been with the program a little bit longer.
Sure.
Ty Washington's played more football in bigger environments, but not by much. And so that's going to be interesting to see.
Yeah, I really don't know what to make of it, Trev. I mean, that's the thing is I would say I think he's definitely played a lot more football because Jack Larson's never played any football. But to your point, I mean, he's played 298 snaps in his career. That's one good season of being a good backup.
Mm-hmm.
And is he going to be able to step in and say, okay, now that I'm at Notre Dame, I'm going to be able to step in and provide all of that in one season? I mean, because last year's number 2 tight end played 391 snaps. If you include just the regular season, which is all that Ty Washington, I mean, that's kind of the production he's had. It'd be like one regular season's worth of production.
Yeah.
And, it's kind of hard not to look at it and say, hey, I'll tell you this, he is walking a situation where I do think they need him to step up and perform because, what we saw from Jack Larson this spring is it was interesting because Jack did some things where it's like, that's the Jack Larson we saw in high school, right? Like the catch he made on the sideline against the CJ Carr pass.
Don Schuler.
Right. Don Schuler. There you go. And like, you look at that and you're like, dude, that was an impressive grab. Like that's what we saw in high school. That's the player we saw, coming out of Charlotte in high school. But then we also saw him drop a ball, kind of a comparable ball, and the week before up the seam. And, and we saw him compete in the run game, so that's a good sign. So, like, I think Jack showed, like, hey, there's some tools there to work with, certainly. But is he a guy that is going to be able to do that with any kind of consistency? That we don't know the answer to that, and that's a big thing. Is where you look at a guy like Ty Washington, and he hasn't played a ton of football, but 300 snaps in the SEC is still 300 snaps in the SEC.
Sure.
And he did have that game against Ole Miss. Is that something that Jack Larson's capable of? Yeah, I think so, but he hasn't shown it. At the very least, you can at least say that Ty Washington has done that. And what kind? You're getting a solid athlete. You're getting a big. He looks bigger in person. Well, I should say this. He looks longer in person than he does on film.
Okay.
He's very tall and very long. Like that surprised me a little bit. He's going to have to fill out a little bit. Quality athlete. He's not a guy that I think you're ever looking at and expecting him to kind of come out and like, wow, where'd this guy come from? He looks like the next great Notre Dame pass catcher. But, he, like I said, he has played. You look at the game against Ole Miss. He had a couple really tough grabs in that game. So I think the expectation is he's got to be able to come in and be part of your three deep. I think that's sort of the expectation and perform well enough to where he gives you a quality backup. The big concern for Notre Dame is I don't know at a lot of positions, Trev, if you lose your starter, you got somebody that's a dude stepping in. There's only a couple positions where that's not true. And right now with Cooper Flanagan out, and likely out for the season, tight end is one position where I don't think if you lose your starter, you're putting in someone comparable to him in the starting lineup. Like if you lose Jeremiah Love, there's no other Jeremiah Love in your room, but you have multiple guys go out there and be dudes. Like, okay, they may not be the number one running back in all of college football, but you're going to be fine at running back. You know what I mean? This is one of those positions where I don't know that's true, where you might be taking the biggest drop off of all if Eli Raridon goes down. If Ty Washington can step up and maybe give you some of, like if that Ole Miss game can be something he can do with some level of consistency, then you at least have a quality, experienced depth player to rely on, and that would be important. And then you wouldn't have to ask Jack Larson to go from, to your point, like Jack can do all those things. He's got the skills to do all those things, but you're asking a guy who's never done it to step into a pretty important role as the guy in the pass game. Or at least now, if Ty Washington's a solid player for you, at least have a couple guys that can kind of split that role.
Yeah.
And that's why I think they do need him to kind of step up and be able to help you out and be able to perform for you, because they just don't have a lot of proven players that position that you can say I can count on. I'd love it if Kevin Bauman could play 16 games for Notre Dame this year. Would love it. But I'm not building my entire depth chart around the expectation that he's going to be able to do it. I'm going to make sure that I'm protected in case he can't make it through an entire season, because he hasn't really shown that he can do that. And that's kind of my takeaway on that.
Well, I'll have an article coming out over the next couple days about the tight end position heading into the summer. And this room has probably the most variance on the team if we fast forward to, say, January 2026 and we look back. And it could either be a really impactful group, or it could be, they were just decimated by injuries, because they are 2 injuries away. The way I look at it right now, I don't know what the pecking order is in that room, but based on the blue gold game and what we saw in spring practice, I would have to imagine that it's Eli Raridon 1, Kevin Bauman 2. And the health of the state of your tight end room right now is kind of reliant on 2 players with significant injury history.
One more so than the other, but yes.
And you look at it and it's like, okay, well, if they're not able to make it healthy through a season, your tight end room is now an Arkansas transfer with limited production, a true freshman, and a redshirt freshman with 0 production. Mm-hmm. And that's a very precarious spot to be in. But if it pans out, it's a very good tight end room. So
yes. If that freshman from North Carolina, redshirt freshman from North Carolina, is the player that I graded him out to be out of high school, then he's a good football player. If that freshman from Wisconsin, James Flanagan, is what we hope he can be, which is that of, like, I grade him as a top 100 player, and Ty Washington can kind of somewhat be what he was against Missouri, Ole Miss, and Alabama, because he also had a 24 catch against Alabama right after he had the Ole Miss game, then you're like, okay, you're still good at tight end. You don't have Eli Raritan, but you're still good there. But that's a lot of what ifs from Trev, from three guys that have a combined. What did Jack play this year? I think Jack Larson played a couple. He played 7 snaps. So you're talking about 3 guys that have a combined 305 career snaps, and 298 of those were from one dude. So, yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see. The good news is that if that is eventually your tight end room, because that may be your tight end 2 deep in 2026.
Yeah,
because Raritan's done, and obviously Kevin Bauman's done. We don't know how Cooper Flanagan's going to be coming back from an Achilles, because you never know. But there's a chance that Ty Washington, Jack Larson, and James Flanagan in some capacity are going to be your group. So you're going to need those guys to all step up. There's no doubt. And hopefully Ty Washington can be that guy. If not, then maybe you go back to the portal again for a tight end next year. And next year, I think they'd have a better shot at landing one of the top guys. Like, they reached out to some of the top guys this year, but they weren't willing to commit to them being like, you're not going to come here and be the guy here. You're going to have to compete with number 9. And Notre Dame has very high hopes for Eli Raritan, so they weren't going to promise Max Clare or any of those other tight ends, you're going to come here and be the guy. Because with all due respect, those guys are more proven than Eli Raritan, but I don't think any of them are more physically God gifts, like natural tools. They're not better than he is. So you have to take the risk of, do we take the more proven player or the guy with the higher ceiling? And Notre Dame went with the higher ceiling guy, partly because he's theirs. Yeah. They already have him. They want to be loyal to him and build around him, but he's got the upside and the tools. And so when they were in their conversations with other tight ends, they weren't going to say, you're going to come here and be the dude. You're going to be one of. And I respect the fact they were honest about that, but it did put you in a little bit of a precarious position. So it's going to be interesting. If Ty Washington just being a good, solid rotation player is all they really need right now, just be a good, solid rotation player, move the chains, block, and that's it, then they'll be okay. And then now Jack Larson has another year to groom and develop, and he may play this year, but you won't need him to be – like right now you need Jack Larson to be your 3. And you're an injury away from him being your 2. If he is that in the fall, you want it to be because he earned it, not because you're injured and your transfer didn't do anything. That's going to be the interesting part to this. So it's a very interesting one. And then the final pick, Trev, is Jalen Stroman. Obviously, we saw Jalen at practice standing around because he was injured. But he arrives, and we go into the summer with a whole different view of the safety room than we did going into the spring, which means you have going to the spring or in the summer with a whole different view of what the expectations and needs are from Jalen Stroman than we did going into spring practice.
Yeah, when you rewind and I'm sure listen to some of the shows that we did end of February, early March, talking about how Jalen Stroman enters this room as the probable starter alongside of Don Schuler with a lot of young talent ready to rotate in. Now, after the spring that Luke Talich had, that Jadon Blair had, that Tate Johnson had, that's why I said earlier, it's going to be interesting to see where he fits in, because that safety room took a big jump from the start of spring to where they are now. And so I look at Jalen Stroman, and when I evaluate him, I still just have to go off of really his evaluation when he first stepped foot on campus, because he hasn't played a snap yet. In practice, he's been a part of like the weightlifting group. He was a part of winter conditioning, wasn't he? But then had stuff cleaned up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Because there was a video of right after the title game. Remember they put that video out of the newcomers. So it was the early enrollees and then the early transfer guys doing workouts right after the season. And so none of the returners were doing that. And he was part of that.
Okay. So he was a part of winter workouts, hasn't strapped on the pads yet in any capacity to take reps into live practice. And during that time, you had 3 guys really elevate their level of play. And so when I look back at Jalen Stroman, the things were about him. Virginia Tech didn't ask him to cover that much. Safeties play a big role in the secondary in Mike Mickens' defense. He is a good tackler, comes downhill fast. He's only played in one game in the last year and a half, and unfortunately he was injured. So I look at Jalen Stroman, and I kind of have to ask myself, okay, where does he now fit in? Because I don't think he is now anymore the clear-cut guy to step in and fend off the younger up-and-coming talent. I think he's now in the mix of truly battling for that starting spot. I think there was going to be a competition at the start of spring if he were healthy, but not as highlighted as it is now. Because now I think it's okay, instead of, hey, Luke, hey, Bronte, hey, Jadon, we need you to kind of show your worth in spring to kind of dethrone Jalen Stroman. Now it's, hey, Stroman, you gotta bring it in summer and fall camp, because we have 3 guys right now that are really, really producing and had really good springs. I'm going to be interested to see what happens with him as the season goes on. He's going to play. I don't want to make it sound like he's going to get banned from the bench.
Yeah, the question now is, Trevor, is can you play him in that niche that he was good at Virginia Tech, or does his role expand and he becomes a more all-around player? Because although I liked what I saw from the young safeties, none of them are as proven as what Jalen Stroman is.
Sure.
The issue is that Jalen Stroman is not overly proven in the areas where you're going to ask him to play more at Notre Dame. Now, if Notre Dame's defense is a little bit more zone-oriented, a little bit more, okay, one of those safeties is going to kind of come at, be it like an alley player a lot more, then that fits right into his wheelhouse. And so I'm very curious to see, again, the evolution of the coverage schemes and how it affects the safeties, because that's going to determine how well Jalen Stroman fits. I like Jalen Stroman as a player, though. I do. I think he's a downhill kid. You know, he's not he's not like as smooth athletically as Xavier Watts was. He's a little bit more, I think, vertically explosive. He's not as fluid, change of direction, flipping your hips as what Xavier was. It wouldn't shock me if he runs a little bit of a better 40 time than Jalen or than Xavier did. But I also don't think he'll have sort of the agility numbers that Xavier did either. They're different athletes. You know, he's a little bit longer, a little bit more of a powerful hitter. He's a little bit more like a Don Schuler than he is Xavier Watts.
Yeah.
And so that's part of like where you look at and say, if he's going to become that guy where he's playing more, he's going to have to show that he can do it. Now, he wasn't bad in coverage at Virginia Tech. He wasn't. It's just they rarely asked him to do it. He just wasn't used in coverage a lot. Like I'm watching, I'd go through whole game film, Trev, and the only coverage I would see him do is squeezing down on quick Y options and crossing routes. Everything else was zone oriented. It was all like coming downhill and kind of playing the alleys, and they just didn't put him in a lot of situations where he was going to be playing man coverage. And if you look at, for example, his career at Virginia Tech, he was only targeted 24 times in his career at Virginia Tech in coverage, because a lot of times he'd play off the hash, he'd play deep middle at times as well. They just didn't put him in a lot of situations where he was in coverage a whole lot, and he didn't give up a whole lot of yards when he was targeted. Where if you look at, for example, Xavier Watts this past season, and you look at how many times he was targeted this season. 32 times this season. And that's more than what Jalen Stroman was targeted in his entire career at Virginia Tech. So that's going to be a change for him. I don't know that he can't do it. I'm not saying he can't do it. I'm saying he's got to show that. I think that's partly why going to Notre Dame is good for him, because it's going to ask him to get out of his comfort zone a little bit and expand his game. And if he's able to expand his game, then I think that makes him a much more attractive player for the National Football League, as opposed to a guy that's just an alley player. Where in the NFL, I don't watch as much as I used to, Trev, but I'm pretty sure in a passing league, I do know it's that there's not like this high market for guys who don't cover at safety. They're just alley players. So I think it's going to be good for Jalen to kind of put in this comfort zone and to get the kind of coaching he's going to get at Notre Dame. The question is what's his role going to be? We're going to find that out. But if he can get back to being the guy he was at Virginia Tech in 2023, that's a big addition.
Oh, yeah.
If he can be that guy and show a comfort level in coverage that he wasn't asked to show at Virginia Tech, then it's a huge addition to this secondary because he is a physical, bigger-bodied kid than what you had. So I'm excited about the pickup. And his injury wasn't one that was lower body. So if you have any concerns with Jalen Stroman health-wise, it's more so about can he stay healthy with the hitting? Is his shoulder going to give again? That's different than I don't know if this guy can run anymore, or I don't know if this guy can flip his hips anymore because he had a hip injury, or I don't know if he can change direction anymore or play with speed anymore because he tore his Achilles or he tore his ACL or he tore his PCL or his patella. It was a clavicle. So now it's just like, can he hold up to tackling and the physicality of the sport? That still remains a question mark. But it wasn't a lower body injury to where, you worry about him not being able to run. What's his lower body conditioning like? What's his strength like in the lower body? All those things that come with someone who had to get work done. Like Riley Leonard had to get multiple surgeries done on his ankle and foot. That meant he was going through months where he wasn't running. He wasn't in. This is not true for Jalen Stroman. He's still able to do all those conditioning things, agility drills, and all that. It's just about now build that strength up in that rebuild the strength in the upper body. So I think he's got a chance to obviously do that and do that relatively quickly. That's not a position. So overall, Trev, looking at this group now post-spring from where they were pre-spring, what are your thoughts on this portal class? About where you thought it would be, a little behind, a little ahead. Where do you see it right now?
I would say a little behind. I don't want that to come off as a negative. There's just some things that I didn't get to see this spring that I would have liked to, like Jalen Stroman. He was around in winter workouts. We didn't get to see him this spring. Will Pauling wasn't at 100% throughout the spring. So it's just more of an incomplete grade from me. It's not so much, I thought they were going to be this and they ended up being this.
Sure.
It's I think they can be this. I just haven't seen this. And so that's when I look at this portal class, it's where I'm at, because I wasn't expecting to see much from Hughes just because of what his role was going to be when he came in. There are some limited things that we didn't get to see from the defensive line. And so when I look at guys like Will Pauling, who's at 75%, Jalen Stroman didn't put on the pads once in the spring. So as of today, it's incomplete for me, but the potential is really high for what it can be. And so that's when I look at this transfer portal class, that's kind of how I evaluate it.
I get that. I'm actually more encouraged than I was in the spring because we didn't see Jalen Stroman play at Notre Dame before the spring either. We didn't see Malachi play at Notre Dame before the spring either. We didn't see Ty Washington play at Notre Dame before the spring either. So those are still where they were. Everything about this team is an incomplete to some degree because we haven't seen them play games.
Sure.
When I look at it, however, I see Devonte Smith alone stepping up and looking the way he did makes me more encouraged about it than I was because, to your point, there's nobody that I'm more concerned about now than I was before the spring other than the kicker. But we saw him kick 4 times. It's like – so, like, not seeing Jalen Stroman play, again – I know the baseline of who he is and what he can do because he's going to be playing against teams that he's played against before. Different defense, however. So that's a question mark. But that was a question mark for me before the spring. And so seeing Jared Dawson flash the way he did, seeing Elijah Hughes, because like Trev, one of the big question marks we had, we got answered to a little bit this spring with Elijah Hughes, for example. Because we hadn't really seen a lot of him. Well, we've seen him now. So, and then, of course, like I said, the juice we saw from Will Pauling has me more encouraged than what I did before. Because even though we didn't see him at 100%, we still saw him. And getting to see him kind of show that juice, it's not like, oh, my gosh, I am so excited now because we watched Will Pauling not catch a single pass in the Blue Gold game, but he looked really fast. I'm not saying that.
Sure.
But I can say, you know what? That juice is there. I know he can catch. I know he can make plays. I watched him do it at Wisconsin. Now it's like, okay, how's he going to fit in the Notre Dame offense? So I feel better about that than I did before. the spring. So overall, I'm more encouraged. I'm more confident that this transfer portal class will be what I hope it will be than I was going into the spring. Obviously, there's things we have to learn, but we had everything to learn pre-spring. What we learned about this unit from the spring, I'm encouraged by, for the most part, compared to where we were pre-spring. And that's how I look at it. So that's going to do it for the first part of this show. Let's go to the second part, Trev, here in a minute. But before we do us a favor, folks. Hit that like button for us. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. Make sure you hit that notification bell so then when we do go live, you're made aware that we are going live. You definitely want to do that. And, of course, if you're listening via podcast platform, we would love it if you could give us a 5-star review. Greatly appreciate that. Helps kind of help us spread the news a little bit. Helps the algorithm say, hey, this is something that you want to listen to. And, of course, as always, the absolute best way to support our channel, stay connected, stay up to date, be involved in the conversation is to make sure you signed up for our message board at boards.irishbreakdown.com. Part 2 of today's show, Trevor, and I'm not quite sure if we're going to be able to get to a mailbag today. I hope we can, but that segment went a lot longer than we thought it was going to be because there's some very good conversation.
Yeah.
Part 2 of this is going to say, let's look back at Notre Dame's portal classes and kind of talk about where this one stacks up against those units. And we will look at it from a standpoint of what we know, not so much what we thought about units before, because it doesn't matter. We know what those units were. We don't know what this one will be. But it's saying, can this unit provide what past units have? And when you look over the years, Trevor, and you look back, obviously you had Alohi Gilman shows up back in 2017 and the impact he had. You know, Notre Dame's had some transfers in the past. You go back to even Cody Riggs, turned out to be a huge pickup for Notre Dame in 2014 because Kavari Russell eventually got suspended. He was going to be the nickel. He has to turn into a starter, had an impactful season then. So there have been over the years, Notre Dame has landed transfers before. But obviously in recent years, that's ramped up a little bit with the current portal. And it began with the graduate rules that started back in the 20-teens, where if you're a graduate, you get a transfer right away and play right away. That was the first portal change or transfer change, which is one that I've always supported. I think there should always be rewards for getting your degree as a student athlete.
Yeah.
And that is one of them that I fully support. And so that was sort of the early impact in the portal. So you go back to like from 2020 till now, when we really started to see multiple guys per year in most instances. In 2020, you had Ben Skoranek and Nick McLeod and Isaiah Pryor. I think those were very impactful players. I would say it's fair to say that if they don't come to Notre Dame, I don't know that Notre Dame runs the table that year, especially with Nick McLeod. I thought he was so important to that team. 2021, they get Kane Madden. I believe he was their only major portal pickup that offseason. The next year, they get Brandon Joseph, which was expected to be a huge portal pickup, didn't turn out that way. They get Chris Smith from Harvard, which nobody really talked about when they got him. Turned out to be a very important piece of that defensive line rotation, especially when Jacob Lacey quit on the team in September, decided to redshirt and transfer. They also got John Sott at punter, who had a really good year for Notre Dame punting that year. And then Blake Rupe, who was very solid for Notre Dame, is now in the NFL. The next year, bigger class, Devin Ford, Caleb Smith, Devonte Jean-Baptiste, Thomas Harper, Antonio Carter, Spencer Schrader, very hit or miss class. And didn't quite give the impact that we hoped it would. Obviously, Caleb Smith quit the team even before the spring ended. Antonio Carter never made an impact and transferred out after 1 year. Thomas Harper had a heck of an impact that year. Spencer Schrader, hit or miss. When he hit, boy, it was a thing of beauty. When he missed, it was like, how did you miss a 31-yarder in the same game you made a 58-yarder? I don't understand what's going on right now.
When Spencer Schrader hit, he literally hit, and when he missed, he literally missed.
Oh, it was just like bad. It was it was bad. And then Devonte Jean-Baptiste was a heck of a pickup for Notre Dame that year. And Thomas Harper was outstanding. Devin Ford was a quality rotation running back. I mean, I still think of him serving as a lead blocker against Ohio State. Then this past year, and we're not forgetting certain guys. We're leaving a certain position out for now. Then you look at this last year's class. Bo Collins, starter for Notre Dame. Chris Mitchell starts at times. Jaden Harrison, primary kick returner. R.J. Oben, starting defensive end. Jordan Clark, starting nickel. Rod Hurd, rotation safety. And then Derek Jeter. Mitch Jeter is your primary kick returner. This is the class that offered the most starters of any of the past portal classes. It had some impact moments, certainly for Notre Dame, and then it had an impact beyond the scholarship guys. Jake Defelsky was a special teams guy for Notre Dame this year, but then even more so Max Hurleman, who comes to Notre Dame as a running back, moves to DB, and then eventually takes over as your starting return guy, and then had, I believe I was looking at this earlier, Trev, and I thought I saw he had something like almost 300 special team snaps for Notre Dame this year because Max Hurleman played on all the special teams. Yeah, it was 252. He had 43 snaps on kick return, 102 on kick coverage, 66 on punt return as the punt returner, 40 on punt coverage, and then he was once on field goal block. So, and you're talking about a guy that as a walk-on was one of your best special teams players. You can't ignore that impact in the transfer portal. So I would argue that top to bottom, this past year's transfer class was Notre Dame's best, leaving out quarterbacks. 23, maybe you could debate was there. But what we've seen, Trev, and you made this point before we started the show, they've been able to add impact players through the portal over the years. Nick McLeod, no question about it. Ben Skoranek, at times, certainly. Chris Smith was a really good rotation player that was impactful in that he gave them really quality minutes at a position that was somewhat depleted had he not been there. You look at Thomas Harper, certainly an impact pickup. Devonte Jean-Baptiste, certainly an impact pickup. And then last year, I think Bo Collins is an impact pickup. He had some big moments, but also if he's not there, who's playing that position? Jaden Harrison didn't have the impact we hoped he would have until the playoffs. R.J. Oben didn't have the impact we thought he would have until the playoffs. Same game. So at times, and then Jordan Clark I thought was better than I thought he was going to be. So, but what we didn't have was necessarily, there wasn't that one guy, in my opinion, that had like a Devonte Jean-Baptiste type of impact, or even a Thomas Harper type of impact, a Nick McLeod type of impact. But from a depth standpoint, I think it was certainly your best portal class so far. Now Notre Dame goes into a year where they're hoping to get, and this is, and I'll kick this over to you because you made this statement to me when we were preparing for the show, is the difference between this class and past classes is, even if you look at last year's class, I don't know that anybody thought Bo Collins, we had hoped he could maybe show something, but we never really saw it. Chris Mitchell, maybe, with some of that. R.J. Oben, we thought he could be a good player, maybe be a Devonte Jean-Baptiste. I didn't expect a ton out of Jordan Clark. Thought Rod Hurd would be a solid player, but he was making a position switch. There's much more potential for impact players in this class than we've seen, in my opinion. But the question is, will it be that? But I do want to talk about that first, Trevor, is when you compare this class to past portal classes, we're going to leave out quarterbacks because for obvious reasons. When you're just looking at this position players, can this class provide you what past classes have and then some? Because in this class, I think you're asking it to, where you didn't necessarily ask it to in past years.
I think that's the biggest thing when you look at this incoming class for 2025 of transfers is they're filling positions of need, and not that previous classes hadn't. But you look at some of the upper tiered, almost game changer type of players that Notre Dame has picked up in the transfer portal before. They had to be that. When I look at last year's portal class, Chris Mitchell didn't have to be a game changer of a player for Notre Dame's offense to be effective based on what it had over the course of the season. The stable of running backs, a mobile quarterback, tight end room at times, and then other receivers that you had. Jaden Greathouse, Jordan Faison were both back. You had Bo Collins as your starting boundary. But then you go and you look at defensive end. RJ Oben, I think, was probably the most underwhelming of last year's portal class. Still played well, just wasn't the game changer, game wrecker that people thought that he was going to be. But then you look at other positions in previous years. Devonte Jean-Baptiste was coming in to replace Isaiah Foskey, who was coming off of back-to-back double-digit sack seasons. Didn't get to double-digit sacks, but he had a great season for Notre Dame in 23. You look at previous years, Ben Skoranek. Javon McKinley needed another addition to that receiver room to complement him, and Ben Skoranek was able to do that. So all of the impact players that Notre Dame has had in previous classes were because they needed them to be. And that's how I look a lot of this 2025 class. Malachi Fields comes in, and he has the skills, the tools to be an impact player. Also, Notre Dame needs him to be an impact player in the boundary because they don't have anybody on their roster that's 6'4", 220, and that can play like him. You need Devonte Smith to come in and be an impact player at nickel because outside of that, you have a converted safety in Ben Minnick and Carson Hobbs, who started playing that position not that long ago. Didn't have my watch on today.
I just still like that you thought you could look at your watch and be like, about 10 minutes ago, basically. Yeah, I agree.
So this class has a very high ceiling for impact potential. Like we alluded to in the previous segment, little ways to go, but they're starting off on a really strong foot.
When you talk about expectations, Trevor, I think the discussion primarily, I love the point you made about had to, because one thing that's different about this portal class, to your point, is it has more upside talent, more impact talent, more high-level talent. Like Nick McLeod was a godsend for Notre Dame in 2020, but he went undrafted. He wasn't Benjamin Morrison. He wasn't Cam Hart. He wasn't Julian Love. He was way better than what they would have had otherwise, and he had a really good year. But you could even see, like in the Bama game, that he wasn't on that level. But for that team, huge impact on that team. Ben Skoranek had like 20-some catches. There for like 400-some yards. There was a conversation that somebody had in the chat, and they said, who was Notre Dame's best portal receiver? And somebody said it's Ben Skoranek. And I said, yeah, I think Ben Skoranek's in the conversation. But Ben Skoranek that year missed a couple games because of an injury, had 29 catches for 439 yards and 5 touchdowns. In some areas, he was better than Bo Collins. In others, he wasn't. Bo Collins didn't miss a single game, answered the bell every week, had 41 catches, 490 yards, so more catches, more yards. He had 3 touchdowns, less touchdowns, obviously. But he answered the bell every week, just like Ben Skoranek, blocked very well, and had, just like Ben Skoranek, had some big-time moments also. I think the difference between Bo and Ben is I think Bo's biggest moments were in the biggest games. Like Bo frustrated me against Stanford. Bo frustrated me against Virginia. Like, dude, like, come on, man. Like, you got to be better than that. But Bo stepped up against Texas A&M. Bo stepped up against Georgia as a blocker, and then the one time he gets targeted makes a big play. Bo stepped up in some of those bigger moments this season when you needed him to step up and make plays. And that's something that I appreciate. Now, it's not that Ben didn't do that. It's just he didn't really have, like, the Pitt game was like his biggest game, and Pitt, they won that game 45-3, and Pitt wasn't very good. That was a very weak schedule until the postseason. And he was solid in the postseason. He got like 4 catches against Clemson and then 4 against Bama and all that. But I still think Bo had the biggest impact and certainly the most production, more games, but still the most production. And so, but the point is when you're debating between a guy that had 41 catches for 490 yards and a guy that had 29 catches for 400-some yards, it's kind of like, that's not super impactful. Like that's not like, wow, holy moly, how did you ever succeed without that guy? It just isn't that. And what you're adding in this class is a guy that potentially could be that. And with Bo, it was, and Ben, it was always, I hope that they can do this, this, and this, but we hadn't actually seen it. you hope that Bo could go beyond what he had done in his career, which is essentially what he did last year: 35 to 40 catches, 400 to 500 yards, and 3 to 5 touchdowns is kind of his range. What Ben Skoranek did for Notre Dame in 2020 was basically what he had done at Wisconsin. At Northwestern. Year before he was hurt, so you don't count that, but he was like 45 for 562, 45 for 644, 5 touchdowns. And so you're like, he basically was on a per game basis, because again, he played more games in those years. To give some context, so like in 2017, he had 644 yards, which is obviously much more than the 439 it had at Notre Dame, but he was at 49.5 yards per game. The next year when he had 562 yards, he was at 40.1 yards per game. In 2020, he was at 43.9 yards per game. So the raw number's a little misleading because he played like 13 and 14 games those 2 years. Only played 10 in 2020. On a per game basis, he was basically identical to what he was at Northwestern. Okay, that's fair. Bo Collins, if he's identical to what he was at Virginia, is a much more impactful player than those other two guys were. That's the expectation. And that's what I say is, like, I don't need any of these guys to be better than what they were. I just need them to be what they were. Even Devonte Jean-Baptiste, too, I had said earlier, I don't know that anyone's necessarily been better than what they were at the other school. Devonte Jean-Baptiste is the one guy you could argue was, but I would simply say he just simply showed that he could do what he did at Ohio State with more when he was used more. Because he had a very good production per snap rate at Ohio State. That's one of the things I talked about coming into that season was his success that year. Coming into that year, his success at Ohio State, he didn't play a lot, but when he played, he made plays. He had a very high, sack, per snap rate, that type of thing. So what he did in Notre Dame was show that he could play. He could do that with more volume. He could maintain that playmaking with more volume. And it was a blessing for Notre Dame. They needed him to be that kind of player. Thomas Harper was at Notre Dame what he was at Oklahoma State, which is a really good nickel corner or nickel safety. And same thing last year. Nobody played like Jordan Clark to me is probably one that I would say I didn't think what he did at Arizona State was going to translate overly well to Notre Dame, but it did. It did translate pretty well. So that's how I look at it, Trev, is like, I think what you're adding with this portal class is a lot more of a high level impact player, high level players than maybe what you've had in the past. The expectation is, and a lot of it centers around Malachi Fields, who we talked a lot about, but even Jared Dawson, Devonte Smith. You're talking about a guy, with all due respect to Oklahoma State and Arizona State, those are Power 5 schools. You played in big games, but you're talking about bringing a guy in from Bama where he's played in the biggest of the biggest moments. You're not bringing him in here to just be a guy. You're hoping he can come to be something different. Jalen Stroman comes in with sort of Brandon Joseph type expectations, much more so than what Rod Hurd and Jordan Clark and Thomas Harper came in with. Can he live up to those expectations or not? That's a question. We don't know the answer to that. Will Pauling, if he is at Notre Dame, what he was at Wisconsin, is significantly more productive than what any of those other receivers were.
Yeah.
That's it. So like the level of what they're bringing in this year outside of quarterback was significantly greater, proven production at the Power 4 level, Chris Mitchell being the exception. But again, Florida International, the proven production is significantly greater, especially the skill positions, than what we've seen. Where in the past it was, I hope he can be better than what he was there. Where now it's like, I just hope he is what he already has shown he can be. That to me is one of the biggest differences.
Well, I think last year the trend kind of ended where Notre Dame brought in some portal players that just kind of fell to the wayside. You go back through and you look at some of these transfer portal classes. 2020, Nick McLeod, Ben Skoranek, great. Isaiah Pryor was a good special teams player, but I don't think they brought him in to just be a special teams player.
They were hoping. It's exactly what they were hoping.
Yeah.
He could be for them what he was in high school.
Yeah.
as a top 100 type of recruit as a safety. But
Mm-hmm.
all he'd ever been at Ohio State was a special teams guy. And he was like a backup nickel and a rotation safety at times, but that's it.
Yep.
They were hoping he could be more than what he was, but what he was exactly what he was at Ohio State.
Mm-hmm. And then you go and you look at the 2023 class. Yes, Devonte Jean-Baptiste was solid. He was a great impact player for Notre Dame. Same with Thomas Harper. But then, you had Antonio Carter, Devin Ford, Caleb Smith didn't even make it to the fall. And so
he didn't even make it to the spring game, bro.
That's right. Yeah.
He quit mid-spring. He quit in the middle of a practice. He was like, F it, I'm out. Because him and Chancey Stuckey didn't get along very well. Unlike the young guys who just kind of took his verbal abuse, Caleb Smith was like, I don't need this. I'm out. And just walked out in the middle of practice.
Fair enough.
That was wild.
Fair enough.
Wild.
But, you were there?
No, I heard about it right after. I was like, hey, bro, just so you know, Caleb Smith ain't going to be back. I'm like, what? And he's like, yeah, dude just bounced in the middle of practice. Now, I got more word on kind of what happened later on, but I was like, dude just bounced. Ooh. Okay, this will be interesting.
Man. But point being, last year was the first year that Notre Dame brought in portal players that all played a role and never kind of drifted away to, oh, yeah, he was in the class. You know what I mean? Like I go and I look at even guys like Rod Hurd. Understandably so, he was brought in to kind of line up alongside Xavier Watts. Adon Schuler had the great spring, but Rod Hurd still rotated in and had great play. He had a forced fumble against Virginia. He came in and he had a 4th down pass breakup against Georgia in the Sugar Bowl. Mm-hmm. He still contributed. And I see the same.
At a position he had never played before.
Yes.
He was primarily a nickel at Northwestern. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I see more of the same to a higher degree from this class for all the things that we've talked about. Because 1, they need it. And 2, I think the level of athletes, with all due respect to former portal players, is a grade higher at certain positions. And so top to bottom from this class, it gives you a lot of promise.
But you know what's interesting about it, Trev? And we're gonna kind of go through and say, okay, does it have a chance to be the best portal class so far? What about certain positions? We'll kind of look at it that way. But here's the interesting thing. What I agree with everything you just said. There's more high ceiling talent. There's more established talent in this room than what I think we saw in other years. So yes, RJ Oben was very experienced, but is he any more experienced or proven than what Jared Dawson has been at Louisville? I don't think so. They've both played a lot of ACC snaps, and they have a very similar. I mean, actually, I think the per snap production disruption rates for Jared Dawson is higher than what RJ Oben's was. You look at Theo Riddick. I don't know where that came from. Will Pauling and Malachi Fields, significantly more production than anyone else has done at the Power 4 level. You look at Devonte Smith, did it at Bama, and the production is clear there. He didn't do it as much as Rod Hurd played a lot of football at Arizona State. Thomas Harper played a lot of football at Oklahoma State. The other thing is Devonte, he's more of a corner. Those other 2 guys were a bit of a safety. So when I look at this portal class, and Jalen Stroman is, an all ACC type of player, which is kind of somewhat comparable to what Rod Hurd was and what Brandon Joseph was. So when I look at this class, Trev, I agree with you. It's at the minimum at spots the same as other classes, but overall more potential impact. What I find fascinating, however, is outside of really 1, maybe 2 of the guys, this is the year where they're needed the least than in past years. Because what's interesting is the further back you go, the smaller the numbers of the portal class, the more important they were to those teams because of the overall lack of depth and talent on those teams. If Nick McLeod doesn't play for Notre Dame in 2020, that team is screwed at cornerback, especially once Tariq Bracy kind of had his issues in the middle of the season because you had to then turn to Clarence Lewis. What do you do if Clarence Lewis can't play? You were in trouble. You go to 2021, all the beef with Caden Madden. I still say they should have played a younger player, but you know what? Caden Madden stepped up and answered the bell every week in a year where not a lot of offensive linemen could step up and answer the bell every week. I mean, there was a lot of injuries that year. The next year, Chris Smith, Brandon Joseph, I think overall a very disappointing portal class. And then 23, you have Devonte Jean-Baptiste, Thomas Harper. You needed those guys. You didn't really have a whole lot of options if they don't play. And Antonio Carter wasn't really needed. He was a guy that was that you're going to be a rotation guy, and then hopefully the next year would have a chance to start. Didn't work out that way. Obviously, you needed Caleb Smith. And when him not panning out hurt that team because you had to play a bunch of freshmen. When he decided not to play, you had to then put Jaden Thomas in the boundary. That wasn't his natural position. He got banged up. Then you had to put Jaden Greathouse out there. Like, he would have been your boundary. That hurt that football team. That took a weapon away from Sam Hartman. If he would have stuck it out, he'd have been a good football player for Notre Dame. Even if he just would have repeated what he did at Virginia Tech, Trev, that's still good production because he was kind of a big play guy for Virginia Tech the previous season. Had 37 catches for 674 yards and 3 touchdowns, and I think he was like an honorable mention All-ACC player. That would have been beneficial to that football team and Sam Hartman, who liked to throw the ball down the field. And so when he doesn't pan out, you were kind of in a pickle. And then you look at last year's class, obviously, and we've talked about. So what's interesting with this class is outside of Malachi Fields, I would say that Notre Dame really wants these portal guys to step up. And I would say to a degree they need them to step up. But I would argue that they are clearly in a much better position to thrive if they don't than we've seen in the past. That's the biggest difference between where this team is. And I think what that does is that takes a little bit of, in my opinion, some of the pressure off of the coaches and the portal pickups. Hey, Will Pauling, you don't got to be the second coming of Rocket Ismail at Notre Dame. They don't need you to be that. Just go do your job. You know, even Devonte Smith, who I would argue is probably number 2 behind Malachi Fields. You can maybe argue Jared Dawson in most important, but if you'll have Carson Hobbs, you'll have Ben Minnick, Dallas Golden shows up this summer. He could get a shot at nickel. You could go with the safety, one of your 37 safeties that showed up this spring, and say, I guess we'll just maybe put, Bronte Johnson down there and see how that works. Well, what a tough life that is when you got to throw Bronte Johnson into the game. You know what I mean? So, like, if something happens to Devonte, you may not be as good there, but you're going to kind of be okay. If you don't have Jared Dawson and Elijah Hughes, you still have Gabriel Rubio, you still have Donovan Hinish, you still have Jason Onye, you still have Armel Mukum, you still have Sean Sevillano, you still have Davion Dixon, you'll still have Brendan Vernon when he gets back from an injury. You're going to be okay. Right? And the only position where you really just don't have anybody else is boundary with Malachi Fields. Mm-hmm. I think that takes a lot of that pressure off, and it takes pressure off of the coaches. We don't have to play Will Pauling 65 snaps in the first game. We can work him in. We don't have to play Jared Dawson for 50 snaps a game because we don't have anybody else like they had to do with Howard Cross a year ago. He can be part of a rotation. I think it takes some of that pressure off them, but also takes pressure off the coaches that they got to force the issue with guys right away to try to make them be dudes. I think that's something to keep an eye on because I think that helps with the psyche of the players as well, and of course of the coaches also.
Well, that goes back to what I was talking about at the start of the show. It's just the transfer portal class is a reflection of how well the high school recruiting is done. Because you've gone from a position of, every single player that we get in the portal has to pan out to, all right, well, if they do, that's great and it elevates the team. But if not, we still have a really, really good football team. And the thing that should leave you the most excited, which leaves me the most excited, is we just got done talking about how this could be the most talented transfer portal class that you've brought in. And they don't need them to all be the best that they possibly can be. And that's exciting. That's really, really exciting.
It's about margin for error, Trev, right? I mean, that's really what it comes down to is there's a much broader margin for error with this portal class than in the past.
Oh, yeah.
Where if you don't bat 1,000 or you don't bat 900, you're going to be okay. The better you hit, the better you're going to be. And that's the really interesting thing is on the flip side, if this class does hit and you have all the players you have, now you talk about could this portal class have a comparable impact to your team to what Ohio State's portal class had for them last year? Ohio State was loaded last year. Do they win the title if they don't get Caleb Downs, if they don't get Quinshaw Junkins, if they don't get Seth McLaughlin? And I know he got hurt late in the year, but he was a very important piece of that puzzle during the year. You know, do they have the kind of class they have if they don't have the portal? They were small numbers, but big impact.
Yeah.
Maybe they do, but it's much smaller margin for error. That's the point. You look at Notre Dame this past year. If you would they have still been pretty good without any of the guys that we just talked about? Maybe. They'd have been pretty thin on the defensive end position if they didn't have RJ open. But then you throw in Riley Leonard and you're like, no, they wouldn't have been the same team. And so we're taking quarterback, and that's why we're taking quarterback in this equation. Because it's hard to argue for a team that a class that didn't need a quarterback with ones that needed a quarterback and landed a quarterback. Because obviously in 2021 it was Kane Madden and Jack Cohn. In 2023 it was Devin Ford, Caleb Smith, Jean Baptiste, Thomas Harper, Antonio Carter Smith-Strader, and Sam Hartman. This past year's Bo Collins, Chris Mitchell, Jaden Harrison, RJ Oben, Jordan Clark, Rod Hurd, Mitch Jeter, Max Hurleman, Jake Tefelsky, and Riley Leonard. Well, this year they don't need a quarterback. So it's hard, it's unfair to stack it up against others that had it. So that's why we're talking about non-quarterbacks in this conversation. And when you talk about impact, none of the portal guys outside of Riley Leonard were star players last year. And the fact that you didn't need him to be, I think, again, took the pressure off. But what did we see? I remember somebody got upset on the board. ESPN wrote an article about transfer portal players basically step up big for Notre Dame against Georgia. And they took that as some sort of like insult, like Notre Dame's players. So I don't take it as an insult. I take it as a statement of fact. I mean, Riley Leonard had a big game against Georgia and only threw for 90 yards. Jaden Harrison had a 97-yard kick return for a touchdown. RJ Hopen had a strip sack that was recovered by Junior Telemaka that resulted in your transfer quarterback hitting your transfer receiver for a touchdown on the very next play. So 2 plays in a row, 3 transfer guys take a 6-3 game and turn it into a 13-3 game. And then on the very next play, basically meaningful down, because I think Georgia took a knee after that, right? So the next meaningful down, another transfer takes a kickback for a touchdown. And your transfer kicker hits a field goal when it's 20-10 that puts the game away. It's okay to say, like, the transfer, it was a statement of fact. It wasn't a shot at the returning players. It's a statement of fact. The transfer players stepped up huge for Notre Dame in that game. And so you can make the case that Notre Dame maybe doesn't go as far as they would have if not for the transfer players. That Notre Dame-Georgia game looks a whole lot different if it's 13-6 when Georgia gets their first possession of the second half than if it's 20-6, like it was because of Jaden Harrison's return. And I think Max Hurleman had a big block on that. So did, I think, Luke Talich and Max Hurleman. I could be wrong on that, but I thought Max Hurleman had a big block on that return also. But anyway, so like last year's class obviously had a big impact. Can this year's class have a comparable impact? That's the question. And so as we evaluate, Trev, let's evaluate these 2 classes. When you look at the offensive class, it's Malachi Fields, Will Pauling, Ty Washington. How does that group compare to last year's class based of Bo Collins, Chris Mitchell, and Jaden Harrison? And I think it's in some ways it is very comparable. It's 3 pass catchers and 3 pass catchers. I think last year all 3 you expected to get something from, which is a benefit over this year's class. I don't know that we expect anything out of Ty Washington. We don't know. We hope, but it's not an expectation. Whereas last year, you knew at minimum you were going to get this. You knew that the three receivers were all going to have a shot to be in the rotation in some capacity. Two of them thought were going to start, and they ultimately kind of did. And then you hope that Jaden Harrison could give you a little bit of receiver, but definitely impact in the special teams. What's interesting is until the Georgia game, his biggest impacts that season had been as a receiver. When you think of, obviously, the big catch against Louisville for a big play, and I'm trying to think there was another game. So Florida State, he had a big catch in that game. Like he
played well against Virginia.
Yep, that's another one. Who should have had about a 70-yard touchdown against Virginia. They got called back over a BS penalty. So it was a legit penalty, but it was BS that he did it. It was just one of those dumb penalties. It's like, why'd you do that? It's like the penalty Blake Fisher had that brought back that go ball to Mitchell Evans in 2023 against Louisville. So I think the depth was more proven in that last year's class. I think there's more high upside proven production in this class. If you could say, okay, give me last year's receivers with this offense or this year's receivers and Ty Washington with this offense, of what we know about the group we saw last year compared to what we hope from this group, Trev, who are you taking?
I'm taking this year's receiver class, pass catching class. And honestly, I'd be as bullish to say, based on just having Malachi Fields alone, if I'm looking at this big picture with both classes. And I say that because, yes, there was a question around who was going to be the boundary receiver. Bo Collins didn't come in and step in and answer the bell every single week. But as far as skill set goes, his skill set was relatively similar to Jaden Greathouse's. He was just 2 inches taller. But Malachi Fields, to me, brings an aspect to this team that they
talking about Bo Collins?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. And then I look at Chris Mitchell. A lot of questions last year about the jump that he was going to have to make from the group of four level up to playing at Notre Dame and that level of competition. And then Jaden Harrison, as we know, was brought in predominantly as a returner, paid off in one of the bigger moments of the season. But
I want to say one thing about that. I think it paid off all year because I think teams were just afraid to kick to Notre Dame all year because of him.
Fair.
They got the ball to 25 a lot more than maybe they would have, where teams might have tried to pin him inside because of his presence. Georgia was dumb enough to say, no, we're not going to do that. And I think it cost them. But I think you do have to kind of look at that. They just gave them no chances to return kicks last year for most of the season.
Oh, yeah, that's very fair. The indirect impact that he had week in and week out, that's absolutely fair. But I think when you look at what Malachi Fields and Will Pauling to boot brings to the table, I would take this receiver pass catcher class, even without factoring in Ty Washington. Because I look at Ty Washington and Jaden Harrison kind of the same on offense, not what their impact could be on special teams. But coming into it, it's like, yeah, Jaden Harrison probably going to be a part of the rotation, but being a receiver wasn't the strength of his game. It's the fact that he was an All-American returner. And then with Ty Washington, it's like, okay, where do you fit in that rotation? It'll be somewhere, but we don't know where that's going to be yet. So I would take this one kind of just based on Malachi Fields alone.
I think even if you stack up Will Pauling's proven production at the Power 4 level, it's better than what anybody had last year.
Yeah.
And I think you could even say for him the same things about Bo Collins. He's a Jaden Greathouse type of guy. So I do think that interesting. Then you look at the defensive class. Last year, R.J. Oben, Jordan Clark, Rod Hurd. I think we're all impactful players to some degree. Because if you're part of a rotation, you're on a team that's as good as they were on defense, you're an impactful player because you're doing your role well. And I think that's definitely true of the two DBs. R.J. Oben was disappointing for most of the year. He wasn't bad. He just didn't do anything. He was not like, boy, they're getting run on because R.J. Oben's terrible. It wasn't anything like that. It just wasn't making any plays. Just kind of did his job until the Georgia game when he stepped up and made a huge game-changing play. You look at Jared Dawson. You look at Elijah Hughes. You look at Devonte Smith, and you look at Jalen Stroman, and I think it's a similar case, Trev. It's more high upside proven production than what you got last year, where, Jordan Clark was a very experienced player, but you knew what his limitations were coming in. Rod Hurd was a solid player at Northwestern who was making a position change, who had never really done what you were asking him to do. And then R.J. Oben was also kind of making a change because he was making a scheme adjustment, but that's similar to what other guys are doing. Where when you look at R.J. Oben, it's you had R.J. Oben 1 year, but you've got Jared Dawson and Elijah Hughes in the second class. You had 2 DBs last year, 2 DBs this year. Guy coming in from Bama, who's, I think, a chance to be an impact player. And then you had a guy who's an all-ACC player at Virginia the last time he was playing. So I think this is the side of the ball where it's a little bit more debatable. I agree with you that the offensive one, it's clearly more high-level impact there. I think this one's more debatable. I think the upside is greater on the current group, but I think the floor was higher with last year's group for 2 reasons. One is you had more consistently long production, where Devonte Smith was better last year at Bama than what Jordan Clark ever was at Arizona State. Jordan Clark played for like 4 years at Arizona State before coming to Notre Dame. And R.J. Oben had played a lot more at Duke than what Jared Dawson has so far at Louisville. And then same thing with Rod Hurd compared to Jalen Stroman, where Rod Hurd's not coming off of an injury the way that Jalen Stroman was. Rod Hurd wasn't here last spring because he was still finishing up getting his master's from Northwestern. So I say the floor is higher than with last year's group. I'm more certain that, okay, we knew what they were going to do, and I think they kind of lived up to that floor. This year's group, it's like, R.J. Oben was going to play for this team. I don't know that you can say that about Elijah Hughes. I don't even know that you can definitely say that about Jared Dawson if he doesn't come out and earn it. He's going to have to keep earning it. R.J. Oben was going to play last year. You didn't have the ability for him not to play because of your depth. Before the season even started, you didn't have a lot of big ends. You had a bunch of Vipers, but you have a bunch of big ends. And so I think the floor last year was higher. I think the upside of this group is higher. So I think there's more debate here, Trev. What say you about this comparison?
It is. And it's so tough because the defense last year was really hurt by injuries over the course of the season. And we know what impact the transfer portal class had. Whereas this year, if some of the defensive players that Notre Dame got in the transfer portal, if the people around them in the rotation or in front of them in the rotation gets hurt, there's still more there. What I mean by that is, you look at a guy like Jordan Clark who started at nickel last year, but then the Stanford game, Ben Morrison goes to the locker room with what I'm assuming to be that's when he found out that he injured his hip. And he was missing for most of the second half. Christian Gray was ruled out hours before kickoff. You start a true freshman for the first time. When Ben Morrison goes to the locker room, Jordan Clark becomes your boundary corner at 5'10", maybe 5'10". And then he proceeded to start
in cleats.
Helmet on maybe. But then you look at the defensive line, like you brought up. R.J. Oben didn't have the super flashy plays like what we saw him have at Duke. But with all the injuries that happened along that defensive line, what happens if you take R.J. Oben out of it? No idea. No idea. I mean, are you starting Bryce Young every game? Do you move him to big end? Is it just Bryce Young and Josh Burnham and Junior Tuialamaka? Logan Thomas at times?
Josh Burnham, who also missed several games. He got hurt against Northern Illinois, didn't come back until Stanford.
Mm-hmm.
What would you have done then?
Yeah. It's so tough. Even with a guy like Rod Hurd, they brought in safeties in both classes. Rod Hurd last year, and then they brought in Jalen Stroman this year. Xavier Watts and Adon Schuler, for as many snaps as they had, Rod Hurd still had to rotate in. At times in the postseason, they were playing 3 safeties. There were times against Penn State and against Penn State and Ohio State, there's moments where all 3 guys were on the field at the same time. There's a scenario where Notre Dame plays 3 safeties on the field this year, and Jalen Stroman might not be in that mix. Rod Hurd was more the necessity to have to come in because Luke Talich might not have been ready, because Bronte Johnson was injured for most of the season, because Jadon Blair wasn't on campus yet. So it's really tough. I think that's what makes this the most debatable. because we know what the impact was for this past class due to the injuries. Whereas if I put the same injuries and project that onto the 2025 class, they're more apt to handle them. And so I think that's what makes this conversation so interesting.
Here's another interesting part, and Jason Smith just brought this up, and we haven't really talked about this a whole lot, but I think it's definitely worth talking about. Everybody's like, coaches are never make mistakes. They never make mistakes. I'm like, well, yeah, they do. Even this staff. Jason said, I think we could have gotten the same production from Nana had he stayed that we got from RJ. But can't deny he showed up in a huge moment when needed. And I would argue that I don't even think that's debatable for two reasons. Number one is Nana was more productive last year at Notre Dame, significantly more so than what RJ Oben was this year for Notre Dame. So RJ Oben in his 1 year at Notre Dame had 19 tackles, 1.5 tackles for loss, and 1 sack. Nana, the year before, as the backup to Devonte, had 20 tackles, 5.5 tackles for loss, and 3 sacks in only 12 games because he didn't play the bowl game. RJ did that in 16 games. And then when Nana went to TCU this year, he had 38 tackles, 8.5 tackles for loss, and 3 sacks. I don't think there's any debate that they made a mistake not bringing Nana back. No question that Nana was a better player than RJ Oben. I don't know that I would have agreed with that a year ago. This is why I say sometimes it's like I'm not – that part of the reason I don't bring it up and bang on them for it is because I don't like being critical of something, especially doing it harshly when I didn't have a problem with it at the time. Now, if I'd have said, like, this is a mistake, you guys are totally screwing up by bringing in RJ Oben and let Nana walk. I mean, I think it's like, okay, let's see, because Nana was a really solid backup. My hope would have been, why not have them both play that position? You know, like, but if I wasn't willing to hammer you for it at the time, then I'm not going to hammer you for it now. I'll mention it, but I think that's a great observation by Jason. I do think it ended up being a mistake to not keep Nana, who was a much better player in a Notre Dame uniform than RJ Oben was. But when he transferred to TCU, he was even more productive because he got more opportunities. Imagine if Notre Dame would have had a starting defensive end last year who had 38 tackles, 8.5 tackles for loss, and 3 sacks compared to what they got from the starter this year. That'd have been huge. But that's the thing. Coaches aren't infallible. And that's not me, crush, these coaches are stupid. It happens. Everyone makes bad evaluations. And sometimes it's like, it wasn't even a bad evaluation. It just a guy had something you didn't think he had. And that's why we haven't brought it up a ton. And that's why I have yet to really, but freaking Al Washington, I can't believe he did that. Because I didn't think it was a mistake at the time. I was like, well, we'll see. But RJ Oben was a more productive player in his career at Duke than Nana was at Notre Dame. I mean, that's it. So that's why we haven't brought it up. But it is interesting to think about, had they just not brought in RJ Oben or brought in RJ and then still kept Nana, what that would have looked like. That'd have been very interesting. But I am happy for Nana because that kid gave me everything he had. And he was considered a team leader too, which is interesting as well. So, but yeah, so it is kind of an interesting conversation to have. But when I look at it though, what RJ Oben was not what we hoped he would get. And you hope that won't be true of the defensive line class this year. We hope that we're not looking back saying, well, you might have been better off keeping so-and-so or playing so-and-so more because Jared Dawson wasn't what we hoped he would be. Hopefully he steps up. And that's when we're talking about this comparison is, can this group be more impactful than what last year's group was? And that's kind of where it is. And that's where my expectations are higher. Because when I look at this defense, like you said, Trev, the floor, you knew what you were going to get to some degree with Jordan Clark. And he was a little better than I thought, but he was kind of, the limitations he had at Arizona State, we also saw at times at Notre Dame.
Yeah.
USC especially kind of was like, okay, we can really run, and it was a little bit tougher for him in that game than it was in some of the other games. Do I think Jalen Stroman has a higher ceiling than Rod Hurd? I absolutely do. But is he going to be healthy? Is he going to be able to make it through a whole season? He's coming off of a season-ending injury where he played one game. Rod Hurd was coming off And he'd played like 2,000 snaps in his career. He was very dependable. And that's where I say, that floor part comes in the conversation. But I think the success of this class on defense is going to come down to what do you get from Jared Dawson and what do you get from Devonte Smith? I think ultimately, if those two guys hit and they simply are what they were at their previous schools, this defensive class will be better than last year's, even if Jalen Stroman doesn't play, even if Elijah Hughes doesn't play. Those two guys have a chance at positions of need that if they're just what they were, if Jared Dawson just repeats what he did last year and Devonte Smith repeats what he did last year just on more snaps, it's a better defensive portal class, which then in turn makes it a better overall portal class, taking away quarterback from the conversation. You agree with that assessment, Trev? Or do you think they need more than those two to really step up and thrive?
No, I agree with that. I was actually going to ask you a question, and I'm interested to see what your thoughts are on this. So you can go back and
Trev,
you can.
We're not at the mailbag yet, buddy.
Oh, that's true.
Go.
When you, I should log onto my YouTube account and just put one in.
That'd be pretty awesome.
So when you go back and you look at these portal classes, there is always, and you could maybe say with the exception of 2021, but I'd also hear out arguments for Kane Madden. There's always somebody that comes in the portal class that kind of goes overlooked or not talked about as much, that ends up performing higher than what people would have thought. Last year you had Jordan Clark. There was a lot of that conversation surrounding Javonte Jean-Baptiste in 2023 when he came into Notre Dame. Good player along the defensive line. I don't think people were expecting him to have the season that he did have.
It was a hope. It was definitely not an expectation because he hadn't done it. Right.
Mm-hmm. In 2022, you had Chris Smith, who became a valuable asset to the D-line rotation. And then in 2020, at least for me, maybe you might have at the time, but I didn't think Nick McLeod was going to be as impactful as he was. It ended up being a great pickup. But question is do you think this class has that kind of player that you don't think
defense?
Much of that performs higher than, or is the ceiling so high that if they do just play the way that you think that they will, it won't be a surprise? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Absolutely. I would say the only guy that has that chance is Elijah Hughes. Because if Jared Dawson, Archer in the chat just asked, Jared Dawson had 19 tackles last year and 4 sacks. If he repeats that, do you consider that a successful year? And my answer is, if he does it on the same number of snaps, absolutely. It's a successful year, because that's you have to look at that. So when you look at, for example, Howard Cross this season for Notre Dame, and you look at the production he had this season, well, Howard Cross had more production, obviously, than what Jared Dawson did. And we thought that he had a disappointing season. I mean, Howard Cross this year had 28 tackles. That's 9 more. He played 13 games. That's 9 more than what Jared Dawson had last year. He had 5.5 tackles for loss. I'm pulling up Jared Dawson's statistics from last season because I want to get that real quick. So Jared Dawson had 6.5 tackles for loss. Howard Cross had 5.5. That's comparable. He had 4 sacks. Howard Cross had 4 sacks. So you're basically saying, statistically, he basically is just replacing what Howard Cross did. Here's the big difference, though. Jared Dawson did all that in 239 snaps, or actually that was the 290 snaps last season, 294 snaps. Howard Cross did that on 585 snaps. So you look at Jared Dawson's production and you say his and I wrote an article about this, his per snap production last year was significantly better than what Howard Cross's was. If you look at his snaps last year, or even his total pressures last year, Howard Cross had 22, Jared Dawson only had 12. But Jared Dawson did that on 294 snaps. He would have had 24 pressures had he played the same number of snaps as Howard Cross. But if you look at his snap production from the year before, he had 16 pressures on 239 snaps. And if you give him the same number of snaps as Howard Cross, that's 39 pressures, which is more than what Howard Cross had the year before when he was actually really good. So his per snap production is better. The reason that I would say it's still a good year is because you don't need him to play the numbers that Howard Cross played snaps-wise. If you were in a situation where you had similar depth concerns at tackle that they did when Howard Cross was a standout, then I'd be concerned about that, because it would mean he had that production on a bigger scale, which means he wasn't able to produce on a per snap basis the way you hoped he would do. And so if he played 500 some snaps and had 19 tackles and 4 sacks, I'd say it was a little bit of a disappointing season, just like last year was a disappointing season for Howard Cross. And Jared Dawson on 289 fewer snaps, I believe, if had only 9 fewer tackles, had 1 more tackle for loss and the same exact number of sacks. So yeah, as long as he does it on the same number of snaps, I'm thrilled with that. But like, that's the point, is if Jared Dawson, let's just say he plays 350 snaps, I think he can handle 60 more snaps than he played last year. And I'm looking at it on like the same number of games. So I mean, obviously I'm not talking about, so like he had 294 snaps in 10 games. So let's say he is able to stay healthy and he plays 12 games. That's 350 snaps. I think he can certainly handle 350 snaps in the regular season. I think he could handle 370, 375. I think he could get to 30 snaps a game. And 30 snaps a game would get him to 360 at the end of the regular season. He should be able to play that much, and you'd hope that his production would stay on a per snap basis in a comparable zone. I don't need him to play much more than that, because then I think you get to the point of diminishing returns. And we did see that with Howard Cross at times. Once he got over a certain number of snaps, fourth quarter, he just wasn't as good because he'd wear down because he's a smaller player getting beat up. So, and the other thing about Jared Dawson is he's doing it with 15, 20 extra pounds compared to what Howard Cross is doing with it. So if he has a real productive season, and let's say he's able to do 30 snaps a game, and he finishes with 8 tackles for loss and 5 sacks, okay, that's kind of what I think he's capable of.
Yeah.
If Devonte Smith is just the best nickel that Notre Dame has had, okay, well, that's kind of what I expect him to be. If Jalen Stroman plays like a all-ACC caliber player, it's like, okay, well, that's kind of what he was at Virginia Tech before he got hurt. The only guy that I don't really have a lot of expectations for, to your point, Trev, because that's the premise, is like, you know, like I thought Nick McLeod was a great pickup. He was definitely better than I thought he was going to be, because I remember watching him get torched by Clemson. Like, I think it was the year before, maybe the year before, like 2 years before. But I remember watching him just get destroyed by Clemson. He just couldn't run with their corners. I was like, he'll be better than what they were going to have, but he was better than I thought he was going to be. To your point, Chris Smith, I was like, this guy's going to be like a scout team player. And he was a very important part of your rotation. Just going through, like you said, Trev, every year they've had that kind of guy, except for 21, but they only had 2 pickups that year. You know, 2023, I hoped that Devonte Jean-Baptiste could be that, but I would not have predicted 10.5 tackles for loss. And he was a lot like Khalid Kareem in that when he had sacks, they were like clutch, important money sacks. And then, like you said, last year, with what we saw last year. So Elijah Hughes is really the only guy on defense that has that ability for me, because he's the only guy that I don't have any expectations for.
Sure.
If he steps up and he's like giving you like Donovan Heinisch type of snaps and he's a good, solid player, I'm like, dude, that's a bonus. That's better than what I thought he could be. And the only guy that I could see being like that on offense is Ty Washington. And I think, but doesn't that speak to the whole, I'd like to know your opinion on that, Trev, but I also would like to follow up with this but doesn't that speak to why I think this has a chance to be the best portal class? Is because my expectations are higher, and it's not based on what I hope that they'll do, but just we've already seen it. We're like, we hung all of our hopes on Chris Mitchell on what he did in one game at Arkansas the year before. And we just hope that would project. Now, I still believe with what you and I saw on film from Chris, even though he wasn't great last year, and sometimes like his production would have been significantly better had he had a different quarterback. If he came in this year, I think his production will look a lot different than it did last year, because you have 2 quarterbacks that can throw the ball down the field. So with that being said, just looking at the production for what it was, it is what it is. It was built around hoping that he would be able to do at this level what he did at a lower level. Same with Jaden Harrison. I hope that he can be a better receiver than he was a Marshall, because he wasn't a very good receiver at Marshall. He's just kind of an average receiver at Marshall, but a really good return man. And that's what he was in Notre Dame. Kind of an average player, had his moments, but he's a really good return man. Bo Collins, steady player, solid player, try-hard guy, not a difference maker, was hoping he could maybe play like he did in high school and not what he was, but he was what he was at Clemson. And so these guys, if they are what they were, are much better players. Will Pauling is better than any of those guys based on what he's already shown. If he's just the guy he was 2 years ago at Wisconsin. Tanner Mordecai quarterback, Trev. He had Tanner Mordecai quarterback. He's a much better player than any of the portal receivers they've landed so far. If Malachi Fields is just the exact same guy he was the last 2 years of Virginia, that's it. He's significantly better than any of the receivers they've had. And that's the whole point. Ben Skoranek was at Notre Dame when he was at Northwestern. Bo Collins was at Notre Dame when he was at Clemson. Jaden Harrison was at Notre Dame when he was at Marshall. The only guy that was not that was Chris Mitchell, who wasn't as good. But Chris Mitchell had one big year at FIU in 5. One. It was his last year. He was kind of like what he was the first 4 years he was at FIU. The difference now is if all these guys repeat what they've been, you're getting far more impact than you've gotten in the past, which is why I think ultimately this is going to go down as Notre Dame's best portal class. And the only thing that could keep it from that outside of injury, which you can't control, is that it still may not be good enough for them to be starters. That's the reality. Jared Dawson could be what he was at Louisville and still not be good enough to start on this defense. Jalen Stroman could be what he was in the ACC and it still not be good enough to start on this defense. Like Will Pauling could be everything he was 2 years ago at Wisconsin and it's still not enough to start on this offense. Like that's the difference for me, Trev.
Well, look, hear me out on this. I would go as far to say, now some of this is projecting what we believe Malachi Fields will do, Jaden Greathouse will do, and what Eli Raridan would do. There's a chance that Will Pauling just does what he did in 2024 at Wisconsin and could be the second best receiver pickup that they have. Like, let's just say that Will Pauling does in 2025 what Bo Collins did in 2024. Plays every game, healthy for all 16 games, answers the bell. He's a good blocker, catches a handful of touchdowns, 40 some odd receptions for 400 yards. That matched with what we believe Jaden Greathouse and Malachi Fields would do, I believe, would make that more effective than what Bo Collins did a year ago as the number one boundary guy. Because that is kind of what I believe Notre Dame's offense could be. You know, a couple receivers around that 400 or 500 mark. Jaden Greathouse around that 700-yard mark. Malachi Fields around that 800, 900-yard mark, and a tight end around that 500-600-yard mark. That's what I believe could be what the final stat tally could look like if all of these things come to fruition. But that's, to your point, what I think is so exciting about this is Will Pauling might not even have to, I would love if he did, but might not even have to do what he did in 2023 for us to step away and be like, yo, Will Pauling was a really good pickup this year. It could just be what he did in 24 or what Bo Collins did in 2024. I think there is room for that conversation too. Obviously, I would love for him to do what he did at Wisconsin in 2023. Definitely more than capable of doing it because we watched him do it. But I think that speaks to the state of where this team is at. And that's such a good spot to be in. Such a good spot.
Somebody in the chat said Will Pauling has to show that what he did in 2023 wasn't a one-off. And I think to a degree that's fair. What my pushback would be, however, is that I don't think that you look at last year and say he was normal. He was the same guy he was the year before. He just didn't play as well. I think the difference is when you look at him this year, two things happened this year that were different than last year. Number one is there was a quarterback change after the third game. And the other issue is he got injured early in the year. If you look at what he was doing early in the season, he was on pace to have a comparable season to what he had before. And so I do think that he showed early last year, despite some quarterback issues, that he could be the same guy he was from the year before. And so, like, I'm looking at the numbers real quick. Like, he had 6 catches for 60 yards in the first game against Western Michigan. He had 4 for 48 in the next game again in a blowout win over South Dakota. He had 9 for 83 yards in a win over Alabama. And then he was not the same player. It was banged up against USC and Purdue, and then got injured again against Rutgers and had to come out. And then, of course, he misses the last 3 games of the year and just wasn't the same player. But he had 19 catches for 191 yards in the first 3 games. If you just kind of put that over the course of a full season, that's 70-some catches for 700-some yards. The yards per attempt weren't going to be nearly as good. But again, that can also be something that you look at and say that's also partly because the overall offense wasn't as good as it was the year before. So there's a lot of different things that you look at and you kind of factor that into the overall performance. But I think there's some truth to that is the volume. Can he be that volume type of player? The difference, though, to your point, Trev, which I think is a great point, is they don't need him to be that. They just need him to be a slightly better version of what he was. If he's just in between those 2 years, I think that's impactful for what the needs are. I think it was Archer that said that for them to need him to be what he was at Wisconsin 2 years ago, to need it, not that if he isn't, it's obviously huge, but to need it is a different story. If they need him to be that, that'd be a legitimate question. Was it a one-off? The schedule wasn't super great, and there's some different things that he had a big bowl game and those type of things. So the question would be okay, do you need him to be that? And I think they don't. I think they do need him to be better than what he was last year on a per catch basis. I think the catch numbers, Trevor, are fine. But they need to be like around 12 per catch as opposed to 9, which is what he was last year. But they don't need him to catch 74 balls like he did the year before because they have Jordan Faison. They have Jaden Greathouse. They have Malachi Fields. They have Micah Gilbert. They have KK Smith. They have Cam Williams. They have, all the players that they have. They have a tight end like Eli Raridon. They are throwing the ball to Jeremiah Love out of the backfield. So I do think from an effectiveness standpoint, they do need him to be closer to what he was in 23. From a volume standpoint, I'm totally fine if he catches the ball around the number of times he did at Wisconsin. It could even be less. If he only catches 30 balls and he averages 13, 14 yards a catch, it's a heck of a year as being a part of the rotation. If he starts creeping up towards what he was 2 years ago, then that's like, holy moly, this offense is going to be really, really good. And so that's the difference. And so I think that's also different because you needed Chris Mitchell to be a dude for you last year. You don't need Will Pauling to be a dude for you. You needed Bo Collins to be a dude for you last year, just like you need Malachi Fields to be a dude for you this year. The difference is that Malachi has proven that he can be that. Bo, we hope he could be that. And so, but I still say Bo Collins is still the best portal pickup or receiver they've had, with all due respect to Ben Skoranek. He's still the best one they've had so far. So I think you nailed it, Trevor. I think the ceiling is the key. The ceiling of this group is great. And here's the deal. All these guys are going to have to get to their ceiling in order to play. Outside of Malachi Fields, none of these guys are going to play if they don't get closer to their ceiling because the talent around him is just so much better than it was before.
It's crazy.
Yeah, it really, really is. It really is. I want to just answer just a couple questions here, Trev. We don't have time for a full mailbag, but there were just a couple that I wanted to get to that are somewhat relevant to the conversation we had earlier.
Yeah.
Gabe Weiss says that, says, how close behind is Greathouse to Fields? And just kind of like overall production. And they're different players. That's the first part, is they're different players. But from an overall production standpoint, I will not be shocked if Jaden Greathouse is Notre Dame's best receiver this year. I won't be shocked by it. The reason that there's two things, though. Number one is he's not a boundary, and they need a boundary to complement what he can do as a field receiver, slot and a field receiver. So the focus on Malachi is also partly they can't ask Jaden to do every game what he did in the last two. Yeah. He's going to need that would make him one of the greatest receivers to ever play the game if he does that every week. I mean, he's winning the Blitnikoff. I mean, he's a first-round pick. I mean, it's not – you can't ask him to do that. It's unfair to ask anybody to do that in an offense like this. But he's also, if they're going to make another run, you're going to need to have some complementary weapons around him, and they need a boundary receiver for this offense, especially because you don't have Riley Leonard to carry the offense with his legs the way you did last year. You're going to need whoever your quarterback is to be more effective from the pocket than what Riley was last year. It's a need, not a want. It's a need because they're not Riley Leonard. And so you're going to need that boundary to step up more than you did last year. So that's really what it comes through, Gabe, is there's a scenario where the nature of the position has Malachi Fields catching more balls for more yards. But when you really evaluate the season, you're like, yeah, but Jaden was the dude. He was their clutch guy. He's the one that went off against that big-time team, even though Malachi caught more balls because he was the boundary, which is just going to get targeted more. And up until the last two games, Bo Collins was their leading receiver all year until the last two games.
Yeah.
So I could see that. The ideal, however, is that that Malachi is as good as we hope he could be, and Jaden is as good as we hope he can be. In that scenario, Malachi has more yards, Jaden might have more catches and even more touchdowns, but they're a great complement to each other as opposed to this guy's better than that guy, whatever. It's just because it's different. But I don't think that, Gabe, that Jaden is necessarily behind Malachi other than just proven production over a period of time. I just wanted to be clear on that because he's more proven. He has over 1,600 yards the last 2 years, and Jaden Greathouse is at like 800 or 900. That's the difference to me, on top of just they're different types of players. But will you, at the end of the year, Trevor, will you be shocked if Jaden Greathouse at the end of the year is just kind of your best player?
No, not at all, man. When I look at these two guys, I think that Fields, from a number standpoint, will produce the most consistent numbers week in and week out. I think there's going to be more variance with Greathouses.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if you go to the end of the season, it could be a situation where Jaden Greathouse has more 100-yard games, but then Jaden Greathouse might also have more games under 50 than what Malachi Fields did. I could see it very much being something like that, where week in and week out, I think we're going to get to the point in the middle of the season where you just know Malachi Fields is going to be good for 5 catches for 75 yards. I think that's just going to become a constant. And whereas Jaden Greathouse, depending on the week, he could have, 4 for 35, but 3 of them go for first downs.
Right.
Or he could have the game where he has 7 for $110 and a touchdown.
He goes 4 for 50, but 3 of them for 40 yards are on the final game-winning drive of the game, like you saw to a degree against Penn State, where he had the big play. But think about the clutch plays he made on that final drive of the game. They're not sexy yards. It was like 2 catches for 13 yards, but they were both third down conversions that got him in field goal range. That's the difference. Where Malachi has that big play, you remember that 50-yard bomb for a touch. You remember that one. Yeah. But those ones set up that one, or those, so it's just different. It's different. So I think, Gabe, that's a great question.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to address that before we get out of here and get to that, So we're not going to be able to get to a mailbag today. We have somebody coming over here to do some our water softeners on the fritz. So we have somebody coming over, and he's getting here now. So we are not going to be able to get to the mailbag today, but we will have our BISA hold tomorrow. So make sure you check that out. If you're a member, go on there, leave your submissions. I believe Salty's already started it. But we'll have a mini mailbag on Thursday. We're going to talk about some newcomers on Thursday. We're also going to talk on Thursday about the Andy Staples released his preseason, his post-spring top 25. He's got Notre Dame number 2. I want to talk about that and some other rankings in there that I thought were interesting. So we'll kind of dissect his top 25, have some fun with that on Thursday as well. And then, of course, Friday's the big boy, the big mailbag, which I'm excited about. So got all that this week. We're going to be busy. So, folks, do us a favor. On your way out, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell. But best way to support us, be part of our community, engage in the conversation, ask all the questions you asked in the chat I couldn't get to. Y'all, if you put them on the board, I'm going to address them and get to them. So you're going to throw those on there. But you can only do that at boards.irishbreakdown.com. Have an awesome rest of your day, everybody. 5 o'clock tonight, IB Nation Sports Talk. Sean is going to be talking with someone from Syracuse, talking about Steve Angeli, and, of course, Notre Dame plays Syracuse this year. Syracuse got another portal pickup during the show, Cam Pringle from South Carolina. So you want to be prepared for that as well. So until next time, that's Trevor. I'm Brian. Have an awesome rest of your day, and we'll see you guys again soon on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.